Hey there, welcome to Broderos. Tonight, we've got hours of chilling horror stories combined with soothing rain sounds to help you relax and sleep. Before you drift off, leave a comment below and let us know where you're listening from and what time it is. And don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe right away. If you end up not enjoying it, you can always take it back later. Get cozy and let the fear take over. It's hard to explain why, but sometimes a simple question can send a chill down your spine. Ever asked yourself, what if I could go back in time and warn myself? It sounds like something out of a sci-fi movie, doesn't it? But that's exactly what happened to me. I wasn't prepared for the feeling of reality bending in a way I didn't understand. I was sitting at my desk, mindlessly scrolling through emails, when something caught my eye. It was a letter, no subject line, just my name in the sender's box. At first glance, I thought it was spam. Then, I saw the sender's name, me. It was addressed to me from myself. The thought of it made my stomach twist. I opened it hesitantly. The letter was simple, written in neat handwriting, just like mine. Avoid meeting someone named Victor at all costs. He will deceive you. I stared at the words. My heart raced. Who was Victor? I didn't know anyone by that name. The letter was too specific to be a prank, too personal to be ignored. My hands trembled as I set the letter down on the desk. I looked around my apartment, feeling a strange weight in the air. Everything seemed normal, but somehow wrong. I tried to laugh it off. It must have been a mistake, a joke, or a virus. But the more I thought about it, the more it started to gnaw at me. Could I have written it to myself as a reminder of something important? Was there a person named Victor I'd forgotten about? I didn't want to overthink it. After all, I had enough on my plate. My work was stressing me out, deadlines were looming, and I couldn't afford to get sidetracked. But that night, when I went to bed, the thought of that letter haunted me. I tossed and turned, my mind racing. What if it wasn't a mistake? What if there was some truth to it? The next day, at work, the name Victor echoed in my mind. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was about to encounter something that would change everything. I tried to ignore it, as though it were just some weird coincidence. But the more I tried, the more the idea stuck. Around midday, I received a call. It was from a man named Victor. The name sent a jolt through my chest. Hello, is this Mr. Palmer? The voice on the other end was calm, almost too calm. Yes? I answered, swallowing hard. My name is Victor Mathis. I've been looking into your work for a while. I think we could help each other. I didn't know who he was, but the name felt like a weight, a presence. It took everything in me to hold it together. I wasn't sure whether I should be relieved or terrified. Maybe this was a coincidence. Maybe it wasn't. Of course, I said, trying to sound casual, though my heart was racing. What exactly did you have in mind? We'll meet soon, Victor said, his voice almost reassuring. I think you'll understand when we speak. I hung up the phone, still unsettled. A million thoughts ran through my head. Why did this feel like I was being pulled into something I couldn't control? But I ignored the unease, thinking that maybe it was nothing. Just a random encounter. Nothing to worry about. Right? The next day, I met Victor. He was a tall man with slick back hair and a well-tailored suit. His smile was too perfect, too practiced. I tried to shake off the feeling that something wasn't quite right. We sat in a quiet cafe, exchanging pleasantries, but there was a coldness to the conversation. Something about him didn't sit right. He talked about work, about deals that seemed too good to be true, but my mind kept drifting back to the letter. Avoid Victor, it kept whispering in my ear. Was this the same person? How can we trust each other? I asked, trying to sound composed. Victor leaned forward, his smile widening. You'll learn soon enough. I should have walked away. I should have listened to that letter. But something inside me didn't want to admit that I was scared. Maybe I was overthinking everything. Maybe I was just too stressed from work. But there was an undeniable sensation crawling up my spine, a feeling that something was about to snap. By the end of our meeting, I still hadn't figured out what was wrong. But the doubt lingered, gnawing at me. Something wasn't adding up, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I had just met someone who would change my life in ways I couldn't predict. The next day, the warning from the letter echoed again, louder and clearer. But it was already too late. The next few days felt like a blur. I kept trying to push the nagging feeling to the back of my mind, convincing myself that I had been overreacting. The letter could have been some strange coincidence, or perhaps my mind playing tricks on me. After all, I had never heard of anyone named Victor before, so surely it was just a misunderstanding. But then things started happening. Small things, at first. I noticed subtle changes at work. I'd been working on a crucial project that had the potential to propel my career forward, and everything had been moving smoothly until Victor's involvement. I received an email from him late one night. He was offering his help with the project, suggesting ideas that seemed too polished, too perfect. They felt almost too easy. But I was exhausted, drowning in deadlines, and the thought of a quick solution was tempting. Maybe I could trust him, I thought. After all, he seemed so sure of himself, so confident. But the more I read his proposals, the more I felt something wasn't right. His ideas had an edge to them, a certain risk that I hadn't anticipated. I began questioning how a complete stranger could have such deep insights into my project. It didn't make sense. By the end of the week, everything had gone downhill. What had started as a simple collaboration quickly spiraled into something much darker. I discovered that Victor had been secretly manipulating the project, using my name and work to benefit his own hidden agenda. The worst part was, I didn't see it coming. I trusted him, and I had let him get too close. I started receiving anonymous phone calls, each more cryptic than the last. The voice on the other end would only whisper, "You're in danger." It was the same voice I had heard in the letter, the same voice that now haunted me in my waking hours. I tried to trace the calls, but there was nothing. No leads, no answers. Just silence, followed by a heavy feeling of dread. The office seemed colder, the shadows darker, as if the very walls were closing in on me. People around me started acting strange. A colleague who had always been friendly now avoided eye contact, while another gave me knowing glances when I passed by. It didn't take long before I realized that Victor wasn't just playing games, he was actively working against me. My project, which I had poured my heart into, was now at risk of failing. The people who had once supported me were beginning to turn. Was this his doing? I couldn't tell. All I knew was that I was losing control. That afternoon, I went back to my apartment, the weight of everything pressing heavily on my chest. As I walked through the door, I noticed something strange. A small, folded piece of paper was resting on my desk. It was a letter, but this one wasn't from Victor. It was the same handwriting as the first one, the letter I have received from future me. Victor is not what he seems. He's playing a dangerous game. Trust no one but yourself. I froze. This wasn't just a coincidence. The letter was confirming everything I feared. The man I had trusted, the man who had promised to help me, was the one orchestrating my downfall. And now, it was too late to turn back. The sounds around me seemed to shift. The familiar hum of my apartment, traffic in the distance, the hum of the refrigerator, began to distort. I heard faint footsteps coming from the hallway, but when I turned, there was no one there. The walls seemed to close in, the air heavier, colder. I felt a chill run down my spine. I grabbed my phone, trying to call someone, anyone, but the call wouldn't go through. The signal was lost. I walked to the window, but when I looked outside, the street below was empty. A deep, unsettling silence filled the air. I felt trapped, isolated. The world around me felt unfamiliar, as if I were stuck in a nightmare with no way out. I had ignored the warning in the letter. I had dismissed the danger, thinking it was all in my head. But now, I couldn't ignore it any longer. Victor had me cornered, and I didn't know how to escape. The air seemed to pulse with tension, the shadows creeping closer, as if they too were part of the trap I had walked into. The future version of myself had tried to warn me. I had ignored it, and now I was paying the price. I had to act fast. There was no more time for doubts. The days that followed felt like a surreal nightmare. Everything I had once taken for granted, every part of my life that had seemed so stable, was now unraveling before my eyes. The letter from my future self, the warnings, the unsettling presence of Victor, it all seemed to collapse into one terrifying reality. I was no longer in control. Victor had become more involved in my work, always offering seemingly perfect solutions. But with every suggestion he made, the project slipped further from my grasp. I couldn't keep up with the constant changes, the constant adjustments. My colleagues began to question me, and the pressure intensified with every passing hour. It was as if I were sinking, and the harder I tried to swim, the deeper I went under. I was losing trust, not just in Victor, but in myself. The phone calls became more frequent, the whispers louder. They no longer came from an anonymous voice on the other end of the line. Sometimes, I would hear them in the corners of rooms, in the rustling of paper, in the ticking of the clock. You're too far gone. There's no way out. It was a voice I recognized now, the voice of the letter, the voice of my future self. But what was it trying to tell me? How had I gotten here? One evening, after another failed attempt to call for help, I decided to confront Victor directly. I had to know if he was the one behind all of this, if he was somehow pulling the strings. My gut told me that if I kept letting him get close, I would lose everything. And something inside me snapped. I arranged to meet him at a nearby bar, a quiet, dimly lit place that felt like the last bit of normalcy in a world that had gone mad. As I sat down, waiting for him to arrive, I couldn't help but feel the weight of the moment. The air in the room was thick, and the shadows seemed to stretch out unnaturally long, as if they were reaching toward me. When Victor walked in, he was everything I expected, tall, confident, charismatic. He slid into the seat across from me and smiled, but there was something cold in his eyes. "You seem tense," he said, as if we were just having a casual conversation. But I could feel the distance, the malice hidden behind that polished smile. "Victor," I began, my voice trembling slightly, "I need to know what's going on. I need to understand what you've done." He tilted his head, amusement flickering across his face. What do you mean? I'm just helping you out. You're the one who came to me for assistance. No, I shot back. This is more than just help. You're manipulating everything, Victor. You're making things worse. You're using me. He leaned back, studying me with those piercing eyes. I'm just trying to help you see the bigger picture. You're too blind to understand it. But don't worry, he said, leaning in close. You'll figure it out soon enough. Something about his words sent a cold shiver down my spine. Was he playing me? Or was he truly just that confident? Either way, I was starting to feel like I was losing control of everything. Suddenly, the door to the bar slammed open, and the chill of the night air swept in. I turned instinctively to look, but no one had entered. The room was empty again. I looked back at Victor, but he wasn't paying attention. His gaze was fixed on something behind me, something I couldn't see. I followed his eyes and froze. There, in the reflection of the mirror behind the bar, I saw a shadow, a figure standing just out of sight. It was tall, almost as if it were hovering, but the figure wasn't clear enough to make out. The reflection seemed to warp, flickering between shadows and shapes that didn't make sense. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. Victor's expression didn't change, but I could feel the tension rising in the air. He knew something I didn't. The figure in the reflection seemed to move closer, its outline becoming clearer. It was then that I realized it wasn't just a reflection. It was there, in the room with us. And it wasn't human. I jumped up, knocking my chair over, my heart pounding in my chest. Victor didn't flinch. He just watched, like he was waiting for something. Waiting for me to understand. The figure took a step forward, and with it, the temperature in the room dropped. I could see my breath now, thick and white in the air. The shadow moved toward me with unnatural speed, and for the first time in days, I felt truly afraid. Get out of here, I whispered, backing away. But Victor just sat there, unmoved. You can't run from this, he said calmly. It's already happening. Before I could respond, the figure lunged. It was too fast, too sudden. And just as it reached for me, everything went black. I woke up in my apartment, disoriented and gasping for air. The room was still, but the silence was deafening. The shadow was gone, but the feeling remained, like I was still being watched, like I had just narrowly escaped something far worse. Victor's face flashed in my mind. Was he involved in this? Or was he a part of something larger, something I couldn't understand? I didn't know what was real anymore, or what was part of the twisted web I had walked into. The letter, the warnings, the figure, it all led to one question. What was I supposed to do now? The events of that night haunted me like a nightmare that refused to end. I couldn't tell what was real anymore. My apartment felt different, like the walls had shifted, and the air was thick with a presence I couldn't explain. Every creak of the floorboards, every faint sound in the hallway made my pulse quicken. I was no longer sure if I was alone, even while I was in the silence of my own home. I kept telling myself that I had to be strong, that this wasn't real, but deep down, I knew it wasn't just my mind playing tricks. That figure in the bar, that shadow, there was something more to it. And Victor. He wasn't just involved in this, he was at the center of it. I had ignored the warnings, thinking I could handle things myself, but now I realized how deeply I had been deceived. I was entangled in something much darker than I had imagined. I tried to push through the day, to pretend everything was fine. But every moment felt like a test of my sanity. When I arrived at work, the office seemed colder. The lights buzzed louder than usual, and the hum of conversation sounded distant, as though it was happening in another world altogether. People spoke to me, but I could barely hear them over the pounding in my ears. I felt disconnected from everything, like I was trapped in a fog of confusion. Victor had been unusually quiet since our meeting. He hadn't reached out, hadn't called, but his presence loomed over me like a shadow I couldn't escape. I found myself looking over my shoulder every few minutes, expecting him to appear any moment. Every phone call, every email, it all felt like part of a grand design, a plan I didn't understand. Then, the calls started again. They came late at night, as I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to fight off the creeping anxiety that had taken over my life. The phone would ring, its shrill sound echoing in the silence. I'd answer, but no one would be on the other end. Just the sound of heavy breathing, followed by a soft, almost inaudible whisper, "You can't run away. You're already lost." I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being pulled deeper into something I couldn't control. The fear had become a constant companion, lurking in every corner of my mind. Was this just stress? Or was something truly trying to drag me into its grip? One night, after the call, I sat in front of my computer, trying to make sense of everything. I searched through old emails, trying to find a clue, anything that would explain what was happening. That's when I stumbled across an old message, a message I had missed the first time I checked. It was from Victor. The subject line was simple: "I know you're confused. Let me explain." I opened it quickly, almost desperate for answers. The email was brief, but it sent a shiver down my spine. "You're not meant to understand everything. You never were. But you will soon. The time is coming, and when it does, everything will change. The shadow is closer than you think." The words were cryptic, but the last sentence hit me like a punch to the gut. The shadow. Was it the same figure I had seen at the bar? Was it connected to Victor somehow? I sat back, trying to process it, but the more I thought about it, the more questions piled up. I had to find answers, no matter the cost. But where could I even begin? The warning had been clear: trust no one but yourself. That night, I couldn't sleep. My mind raced, and I felt as though I were being drawn into a storm I couldn't escape. I got up and walked around my apartment, trying to calm my nerves. The silence felt oppressive, suffocating. Then, suddenly, I heard it, a faint sound coming from the kitchen. The soft rustling of something shifting in the dark. I froze. I knew I was alone. There was no one else here. My heart pounded in my chest as I slowly moved toward the sound. The kitchen light flickered, casting eerie shadows on the walls. When I reached the doorway, I paused, my breath catching in my throat. There, sitting on the counter, was another letter. The same handwriting as the others, as the one that had started all of this. I picked it up with trembling hands, my mind racing. It was almost too much to process. What did it say this time? You think you're in control, but you've already made your choice. There's no turning back now. The words hit me like a blow. My mind was spinning. What choice? What had I done? Had I unknowingly walked into some kind of trap? Before I could make sense of it, I heard something else. The floorboards creaked behind me. Slowly, I turned around. There was nothing there. The room was empty. But the air had changed. It felt heavier, thicker, as if something was waiting in the shadows. The silence had become unbearable, and the feeling of being watched intensified. I rushed to the window, pulling back the curtains. The street outside was empty, but as my eyes scanned the darkness, I noticed something strange. A figure standing at the far end of the alley, motionless, staring back at me. I couldn't see its face, but I knew. I could feel it. The shadow had found me. My heart raced as the figure slowly began to move toward me. I couldn't stay here. I couldn't run away. The room felt like it was closing in, the walls pressing in on me. I had to leave, but I didn't know where to go. There was nowhere left to hide. I turned to grab my things, but the door slammed shut with a deafening crash. The air grew cold, the temperature dropping rapidly. The figure outside the window was now standing right in front of it, its face still hidden in the shadows. I backed away, my breath coming in short gasps. There was nowhere left to run. And then I heard Victor's voice again, whispering in my ear. "You've made your choice, and now you'll face the consequences." And in that moment, I realized the truth. I wasn't just fighting to survive. I was fighting for my very soul. The room was suffocating. The air had turned icy, and each breath felt like a struggle against the crushing weight of something unseen. The figure outside the window remained motionless, but I could feel its presence as if it were inside the room with me. It was close, too close, and my heart pounded against my chest as I backed into the corner, desperate for an escape that seemed to grow further out of reach. Victor's voice still echoed in my mind, his words repeating in a loop. "You've made your choice." But what choice had I made? I hadn't chosen any of this. I hadn't asked for any of it. How could I have known that trusting him would lead me down this dark path? I turned to the window again. The figure was gone, but I could still sense it, lurking just beyond my vision, waiting. I stumbled back, my hands grasping the edge of the desk to steady myself. The room seemed to tilt, as if the very foundation of reality was shifting beneath me. The letter, the warnings from my future self, it had all led to this moment. I had ignored the signs, hoping they were just a product of my stress or paranoia. But now, I couldn't deny the truth any longer. Someone, was pulling the strings, and I had walked right into its trap. Suddenly, the silence was broken by a sound, a low, eerie hum, like the buzzing of 1,000 voices, distant yet close. It filled the room, and I clutched my ears, trying to block it out. The walls seemed to pulse with the noise, and the shadows on the walls began to move, stretching and contorting like living things. I wasn't alone anymore. The figure that had been outside my window was now standing in the doorway, its outline barely visible in the dim light. It moved forward, slow but deliberate, as if it were savoring the moment. I could feel the temperature drop even further, the chill biting into my skin. And then I saw its face. It wasn't human. The features were blurred, shifting, as if they were trying to form into something recognizable but failing. The eyes, if you could call them that, were dark voids, endless and consuming. I felt as though they were staring into my soul, peeling away every layer of defense I had built up over the years. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. The figure raised its hand, and I felt an overwhelming sense of dread. The air around me thickened, and the hum grew louder, almost deafening. My vision blurred, and for a moment, I thought I might pass out from the pressure. But just as quickly, the figure stopped moving. Victor's voice cut through the chaos, sharp and clear. "You're not ready to face this. You never were." I looked around, desperate for an explanation, but there was no one else. Only the figure, still standing at the door, waiting. And Victor, somewhere, watching, controlling everything. You've been pulling the strings all along, I gasped, barely able to form the words. You've been manipulating me, pushing me toward this moment. Victor's laugh was low, almost mournful. You never realized the truth, did you? You've always been a part of this. From the moment you opened the first letter, you sealed your fate. This is the consequence. The figure stepped forward, its hand now reaching out toward me. The air crackled with energy, and I felt an unbearable weight pressing down on me. The shadows in the room seemed to gather around the figure, like a cloak, as if it were feeding on the fear I had allowed to grow inside me. I backed away, my legs trembling, but there was nowhere left to run. The figure was closing in on me, its presence overwhelming. I could hear my heartbeat in my ears, could feel the blood rushing through my veins in panic. The whispers, the voices, grew louder, overlapping, becoming one indistinguishable sound. You can't escape. I closed my eyes, willing the terror to stop. But it didn't. It only intensified. I heard a voice, not Victor's this time, but my own, a whisper from somewhere deep inside me. You have the power. You always have. What? For the first time since this nightmare began, I stopped running. I stopped fighting the terror that had taken hold of me. I opened my eyes, and in that moment, something inside me clicked. The fear, the confusion, it was all a part of the game. I had been so focused on trying to survive, trying to make sense of the impossible, that I had missed the one thing that could free me, my own will. The figure was right in front of me now, its hand reaching for my throat. But instead of recoiling, I reached out. I wasn't sure how, but I felt something within me, something that had been there all along, surge forward. The shadow recoiled, as if it had been struck. The room seemed to flicker. For a moment, everything froze. The figure, the darkness, Victor's voice, all of it hung in the balance. And then, in a sudden, blinding flash, the figure dissipated, vanishing like smoke. The room was silent again. I collapsed to the floor, gasping for breath, my heart pounding in my chest. It was over. For now. But I knew something had changed inside me. The terror, the doubt, it had been replaced with something stronger. A sense of clarity. I had faced the darkness and survived. But I wasn't the same. The letter had been right. There was no turning back now. And I had learned the hardest lesson of all. In the end, the only thing I could trust was myself. Have you ever driven for hours, only to suddenly find yourself on a road you didn't recognize? Maybe the landscape looks familiar, yet something feels wrong. Maybe the sky seems to hold a certain weight, or the air feels too still. I never thought it would happen to me, not after all these years. But it did, and it changed everything. I'm Alex, and I spend a lot of time on the road. My job requires long drives through remote areas, out in the countryside, past sleepy towns, down highways that stretch endlessly across the horizon. It's a job I never really minded. I enjoy the solitude, the quiet. It gives me time to think, to be alone with my thoughts. But this trip was different. It had started out like any other. The roads were smooth, the sun was high, and my playlist hummed quietly in the background. The only sound was the faint hum of the engine and the occasional beep of the GPS. It was a comfortable kind of solitude, the kind I had grown used to. I didn't mind the long hours or the empty stretches of road. But then, just past mile marker 250, something happened. I looked down at my GPS, expecting it to show the familiar path leading me to my destination. But instead, the screen was flashing. A notification appeared, something I had never seen before. Coordinates. I didn't recognize them, and they didn't make sense. The location didn't exist on any map I had ever seen. A place I had never been, and yet my GPS insisted that I was close to it. Latitude 43 degrees 55 minutes north. Longitude 97 degrees 32 minutes west. I felt a strange unease spread through me. The coordinates were in the middle of nowhere, deep in the forest, far off the beaten path. My first instinct was to ignore it. A glitch, I thought. Just a malfunction. I've been using this GPS for years, and never once had it steered me wrong. But something made me pause. Curiosity, I suppose. It wasn't like me to take detours. But that day, I didn't have much else on my mind. I wasn't in a rush. So, I tapped the screen, setting the course toward the mysterious location. The road turned narrower, the landscape around me becoming more unfamiliar. The trees closed in, their dark trunks forming a tunnel that swallowed the sunlight. It felt like I was driving deeper into some forgotten place, and the air, once warm, now felt thick with an unspoken tension. The GPS showed no sign of any other cars. The silence was almost suffocating. I drove on. The sun began to dip lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the road. The further I went, the more unsettling the surroundings became. I passed a small abandoned gas station, the building crumbling, windows boarded up. The road stretched ahead, curving into the trees like a snake slithering into the unknown. The eerie stillness was broken by a sudden pop in the radio, followed by a crackling static. I glanced at the dashboard. Everything seemed normal. I tried to adjust the volume, but nothing happened. The radio had gone completely silent, except for the occasional hiss and crackle. Then, just as I was about to dismiss it as a malfunction, I saw something in the distance, through the trees, partially obscured by the thick undergrowth. It was a building. A house. Old, dilapidated, and completely out of place in this remote part of the world. It wasn't on any map, and I didn't recall seeing anything about it in any of the nearby towns I passed. It looked abandoned, forgotten. But something about it, something in my gut, told me it was more than that. The coordinates had led me here. I slowed the car as I neared the house, a creeping unease crawling up my spine. My heart pounded, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I turned off the engine, the sudden silence deafening. The air felt colder now, biting through the rolled-down window. A soft breeze rustled the leaves, and in the distance, I could hear the faint echo of something that sounded like footsteps. But no one was there. The house sat in front of me, still and waiting. There was a strange pull, an invisible thread that seemed to connect me to that house. My feet moved before I could think, the door creaking open as I stepped out onto the dirt road. The ground felt uneven underfoot, and the once familiar sound of tires on asphalt was replaced by the crunching of dry leaves. I moved toward the house, unable to stop myself. My mind told me to turn back, but my body kept moving forward, as if something else was guiding me. The house grew larger as I got closer. The windows were dark, but there was something about the place that felt familiar. Like I had seen it before, or been here before. I couldn't place it, but the sensation was strong. My mind raced, trying to figure out why this house felt so important, so tied to me. I reached the porch and stopped, standing still for a moment. My breath hung in the cool air. It wasn't just the house that unnerved me. It was the feeling that I was being watched. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I glanced around, expecting to see someone, but the forest was still, the shadows stretching longer with the setting sun. I reached for the door handle. It turned easily in my hand, but with creaking under the pressure. The door opened with a soft groan, revealing the darkness inside. I hesitated, staring into the blackness, my heartbeat quickening. What was this place? Why did it feel so connected to me? I stepped inside, the door closing quietly behind me. And that's when I saw it. A faded photograph on the wall, yellowed with age. A family photo. My family. I gasped, stepping closer. It was a picture of my mother, father, and me as a child, standing in front of this very house. I had no memory of ever being here. But somehow, I knew this place had something to do with me, and with my family's past. My heart thudded painfully in my chest as I stared at the photograph. I had never seen this house before, never known it existed, yet there I was, smiling, standing beside my parents in front of this decaying building. My breath caught in my throat. I turned the photo over, desperate for some kind of explanation, some clue to what this place was. But the back was blank, offering no answers. It felt as though the house itself was mocking me, holding the secret I couldn't remember. A cold draft swept through the room, rustling the curtains and making the floorboards creak beneath me. The house seemed to groan, as though it were alive, its ancient wood stretching and shifting in the stillness of the night. I shuddered, the hairs on my arms standing on end. I needed answers. I couldn't just leave, not with so many questions gnawing at me. I took a tentative step further into the house, the floor creaking beneath my weight. The place felt abandoned, but something told me it hadn't been empty for long. There was a sense of life here, something that lingered just out of reach. I moved down a dark hallway, the walls lined with peeling wallpaper and faded portraits. The air smelled musty, as if the house hadn't seen sunlight in years. Yet, there was a heaviness in the atmosphere, something oppressive, something I couldn't shake. The floor seemed to groan beneath me as I walked deeper into the house. I passed a room that was nearly completely obscured by shadows. Curiosity gripped me, and I pushed the door open. The room was empty, save for a single piece of furniture, an old rocking chair sitting by a fireplace. The chair rocked gently, as though someone had just left it. A chill ran down my spine. I moved into the room, my footsteps echoing in the silence. The air was thick here, heavy with the scent of something old and forgotten. I approached the fireplace, where an old photograph had been placed on the mantel. My breath hitched in my throat as I recognized the figures in the picture. My mother and father, standing together in front of this very house. But the expression on their faces was different in this photo. Their smiles were gone, replaced by a look of tension and fear. A door creaked in the distance, and I froze. Someone else was in the house. My pulse quickened, my instinct screaming at me to leave. But I couldn't. I needed to know what had happened here, what connection this place had to my family. The door at the end of the hallway was ajar, and I hesitated before moving toward it. Each step I took seemed to amplify the silence, as if the house was holding its breath. The door opened with a soft creak, revealing a small, dimly lit room. It was filled with old furniture, covered in dust and cobwebs. But what caught my attention was the desk in the corner. On top of the desk lay an old journal. I approached it cautiously, as if it were some kind of relic that had been waiting for me. The pages were yellowed and fragile, but the handwriting was still legible. I opened it slowly, reading the first few lines. The house feels wrong. It feels like it's watching us. I'm not sure how much longer we can stay here. Alex is getting worse. The words sent a jolt of electricity through my body. My name. It couldn't be. My hands shook as I flipped through the pages, scanning the journal for more clues. There were entries dated back several decades, but the more I read, the more confused I became. Alex doesn't remember. I don't think he ever will. It's too late for us. But maybe we can save him. Maybe this house still holds the key. The last entry was smudged, as if the writer had been in a hurry or had been interrupted. I stared at the words, feeling a sense of dread slowly creeping up my spine. Who had written this? And why was it talking about me? A faint sound reached my ears. A whisper. Faint, but unmistakable. My head snapped up, and I froze. The sound came again, clear this time, a voice, low and urgent, from somewhere behind the walls. Alex, you're not supposed to be here. You have to leave, before it's too late. I spun around, but there was no one in sight. The house stood still, its creaking floors and growing walls the only sounds in the silence. My heart raced, and I could feel my palms growing clammy. I wasn't alone. The voice, it had come from inside the walls. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end as I slowly backed away from the desk, my eyes scanning the room for any sign of movement. The air was thick, suffocating, and the walls felt like they were closing in on me. I needed to get out of there. I needed to leave before whatever was inside this house found me. But then the lights flickered. And in that brief moment of darkness, I saw it. A figure. A shadow, just at the edge of the doorway. My heart stopped. I couldn't make out any features, but I could feel its presence, tangible, cold, watching. The figure didn't move, just stood there, waiting. I took a step back, my mind screaming at me to run. But my body wouldn't obey. My feet were frozen in place, as if the figure had somehow paralyzed me with its gaze. The air was thick with something heavy, suffocating. The figure moved then, slowly, deliberately. I could hear the soft scrape of footsteps echoing through the room. But it didn't come closer. It stayed at the doorway, its shape barely visible in the dim light. And then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure vanished. The lights flickered once more, and I was left standing in the silence, heart hammering in my chest. I was not alone. I had come here seeking answers, but what I had found was something far worse. This house, this place, it wasn't just tied to my past. It was tied to something far darker. Something that had been waiting for me. I wasn't sure if I could leave now, but I had no choice. The house wouldn't let me go until I understood the truth. The air was heavy, almost oppressive, and I could feel the weight of something unseen pressing down on me. Every breath felt labored, as though the house itself was trying to smother me with its ancient, suffocating presence. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me from the shadows. The figure at the doorway, the one I'd seen for just a brief moment, lingered in my mind. I tried to tell myself it was just my imagination, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. I needed to leave, but my feet refused to move. It was like the house was holding me in place, a magnetic pull that kept me rooted to the spot. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I could hear the frantic beat of it in my ears. But I couldn't leave without answers. Not now. Not after everything I had seen and felt. The walls of the room seemed to close in around me, the shadows growing longer with every passing second. The whispering had stopped, but the silence was almost worse. It was as though the house was waiting for me to make a decision, to either stay and uncover its secrets or leave and forget everything I had found. I slowly turned back to the journal on the desk, my fingers trembling as I reached for it. There had to be something more. There had to be a clue, a hint, something that could explain what was happening here. I flipped through the pages, scanning each one for more details. The entries became more frantic as I read. They were filled with fear and confusion, as though whoever had written them had been slowly unraveling. The house is changing us. We can't stay here. It's too dangerous. Alex doesn't remember, but I know the truth. He has to know. I'm not sure how much longer I can hold on. The house is calling to me. It's calling to all of us. But Alex, he can't go through what we did. He can't remember. I stopped reading. My hands shook as I set the journal down. This wasn't just about a house. This was about something far darker. Something my family had been caught in, something that I had been pulled into without even realizing it. The truth was just beyond my reach, but I could feel it. It was in the air, in the walls, in every creak of the floor beneath my feet. I had to find out what happened here. I had to know what had been kept hidden from me. The floorboards creaked under my weight as I moved toward the hallway, the shadows stretching in all directions. I passed the room with the rocking chair, its movement now completely still, as though it had never moved at all. The house was quiet, too quiet, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was lurking just out of sight, watching my every move. I reached the stairs, the old wood groaning beneath me as I climbed. The upstairs was even darker than the lower floor, the dim light from the dying sun barely reaching the narrow hallway. I tried to steady my breathing, but it was hard. My heart was racing, and my mind was a whirlwind of thoughts, none of them making sense. At the end of the hallway, there was a door. It looked no different from the others, yet something about it felt significant, as if it held the answers I had been searching for. I reached for the doorknob, my hand trembling as I turned it. The door creaked open, revealing a room that seemed untouched by time. The walls were lined with old furniture, dusty and decaying, but there was something else, something out of place. In the center of the room was a large, ornate mirror, its surface cracked, but still reflecting the room around it. It was strange. The mirror seemed to shimmer, as though something inside it was alive. I couldn't look away. My reflection seemed distorted, like a broken version of myself, but there was something more. Alex. The voice whispered again, but this time it came from the mirror. My breath caught in my throat, and I took a step back, my heart thundering in my chest. The voice was familiar, too familiar. It was my mother's voice. You need to understand. You need to remember. I stepped forward again, drawn to the mirror, unable to resist. My reflection flickered, and for a moment, I saw something else, something in the background of the reflection, standing behind me. A figure. A shadow. I spun around, but the room was empty. I stared at the mirror again, my mind racing. It was impossible, but the figure I saw in the reflection, it looked like my father. His face was twisted in anguish, as though he were trying to warn me. But what was he trying to tell me? What had happened here? The house, it's not just a house, the voice continued, growing fainter. It holds our memories, our pain. It's tied to you, Alex. It's tied to everything. The air grew colder, and the shadows around me deepened. The house was alive, it was changing, and I was part of it. The past wasn't just something I could walk away from. It was embedded in these walls, in the very fabric of this place. I needed to know more. I had to. I turned and rushed toward the door, desperate to escape the room. I had to find the truth, no matter the cost. But as I moved to leave, the door slammed shut in front of me with a deafening crash. The house groaned, and I could hear the sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, coming from the hallway. Someone, or something, was coming. I backed away, my mind reeling. The shadows shifted, and a figure appeared at the doorway. It was my father. But this time, his eyes were empty, hollow. His face was pale, and his mouth moved, but no sound came out. "Alex," he whispered, the voice distorted and hollow. "You shouldn't have come back." The house seemed to breathe around me, its walls closing in, its very foundation shifting. I couldn't escape. Not now. Not until I understood what had happened here. But deep down, I knew there was no turning back now. I had already become part of its story. And that was a story that had no ending. At least, not yet. The figure of my father stood motionless in the doorway, his empty eyes fixed on me. I tried to move, to run, but my legs felt like lead. The air was thick, almost choking, as if the house itself was pressing in on me. The shadows in the room grew darker, more oppressive, and the very walls seemed to be pulsating with an eerie life of their own. "Alex," the voice came again, barely a whisper, but it felt like it was coming from everywhere, echoing through the house. My father's lips didn't move, but I could hear him, his voice distorted, like a broken radio signal, carrying with it an undeniable sense of urgency. I backed away from the door, my hands trembling at my sides. I couldn't understand what was happening. The house was changing. The air was colder, and the walls were closing in. I was trapped. There was no escape. "You need to remember," the voice grew louder now, more insistent. It was the same voice I'd heard in the journal, in the whispers from the walls. "It's all connected. The house. Your family. The past. You can't run from it." I turned my gaze back to the mirror. The reflection of the room in the cracked glass was no longer still. It was shifting, flickering, as if the mirror was showing me a different version of reality, one where my father wasn't a hollow figure in the doorway, but a living, breathing man. But there was something wrong about him, something off. The reflection of my father in the mirror smiled. But it wasn't a smile I recognized. It was twisted, dark, and unsettling. His eyes seemed to gleam with something sinister, and I felt a chill run down my spine. I reached out toward the mirror, but the reflection of my hand didn't match the movement. It was like I was reaching for something that didn't exist. "It's not too late," the voice urged me, but this time it didn't sound like my father. It was deeper, more guttural, as if the house itself was speaking to me. "You can fix it. You can change what happened. But you have to face the truth." A sudden crashing noise echoed through the house, and I spun around, heart racing. The hallway was dark, but I could see a faint light flickering at the end. I had no choice. I couldn't stay here, frozen in the room with that terrifying reflection. I had to find the source of the light. I had to understand what was happening. I turned toward the hallway and began to walk, my steps tentative at first, then quickening as I realized I had no other choice. The house creaked around me, each footstep echoing in the silence, growing louder and louder until it felt like the very walls were closing in. The light at the end of the hallway flickered again, brighter this time. It was coming from a door I hadn't noticed before, at the farthest end of the corridor. The door was ajar, just enough for the flickering light to spill out. I had to reach it. I didn't know why, but I was compelled to. With every step, the air grew heavier. The floorboards groaned beneath me, the house protesting as I moved deeper into its heart. But I couldn't stop now. Not after everything I had seen, everything I had felt. When I reached the door, I hesitated for a moment. The light coming from the room was unnaturally bright, casting long shadows along the walls. But there was something else. A low, rhythmic sound, like a heartbeat, pulsed from within. I pushed the door open slowly, my breath caught in my throat. What I saw inside made my stomach lurch. The room was filled with photographs, hundreds of them, all pinned to the walls, some of them faded and yellowed with age. But it wasn't the photographs that made my blood run cold. It was the faces in them. My family. My parents. But they weren't just photographs. They were memories, preserved in the walls, in the very fabric of the house. Each photograph seemed to be alive, shifting slightly, as though the people in them were moving. The faces of my parents were frozen in time, but their eyes were wide with fear. They seemed to follow me as I moved deeper into the room. I felt my pulse quicken, my chest tightening. The heartbeat sound grew louder, more insistent, coming from the very walls themselves. I stepped forward, my gaze fixed on the photographs. One in particular caught my eye, a picture of me, as a child, sitting on the steps of this very house. But something was wrong. In the corner of the picture, barely visible, there was a shadow. A dark shape that wasn't there when I had taken the photo. It was watching me. Waiting. The heartbeat echoed through the room, now so loud that it felt like it was inside my head. I turned toward the wall where the sound seemed to be coming from. There, hidden among the photographs, was a small, barely noticeable door. It was old, covered in dust and cobwebs, and it looked like it hadn't been opened in years. I approached it cautiously, my hand trembling as I reached for the doorknob. The moment my fingers touched it, the house seemed to exhale, as if it had been holding its breath, waiting for me to open the door. I pulled it open slowly, the hinges creaking in protest. The room beyond was pitch black. I couldn't see a thing, but I could feel something there. Something waiting for me. I stepped inside, my senses on high alert, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. The door slammed shut behind me, plunging me into complete darkness. The heartbeat was louder now, as though it was coming from right beside me. I reached out, my hands brushing against something cold and smooth. It was a wall, but it wasn't made of wood or stone. It was something else, something unnatural. Suddenly, a light flickered on, illuminating the room. And what I saw made my blood run cold. There, in the center of the room, was a mirror. But this wasn't just any mirror. This one was different. This one reflected the room I had just come from, the hallway, the photographs, the door I had just opened. And standing in front of the mirror was a figure. It was me. But it wasn't. My reflection was twisted, a dark version of myself, with hollow eyes and a twisted smile that sent waves of terror through me. "You're too late," the reflection whispered. "You can never escape. Not now. Not ever." The heartbeat was deafening now, the walls vibrating with its rhythm. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. I was trapped. And the house was watching. The reflection in the mirror was a grotesque mockery of myself. Its hollow eyes locked onto mine, its twisted smile widening, stretching unnaturally across its face. I stood frozen, unable to tear my gaze away. The heartbeat pounded louder, a rhythmic thud that seemed to come from every direction, filling the room with its deafening pulse. It was as if the house itself was alive, feeding on my fear. "You can't escape, Alex," the reflection whispered, its voice hollow, unnatural. "You've already become part of it. You were always meant to be." I reached out, my fingers trembling as they brushed against the cold surface of the mirror. My reflection did the same, its hand mirroring mine with a slow, deliberate motion. But then, it was different. The reflection's hand reached through the glass, its fingers brushing against mine in a way that felt too real, too solid. A cold chill surged through my body as I recoiled, my heart racing. I backed away from the mirror, but the reflection didn't follow. It remained, staring at me with that unnerving smile, as if it were waiting for something. The walls of the room seemed to close in, the heartbeat growing louder, more urgent. I could feel the floor beneath me trembling, vibrating with the same rhythmic pulse. The house was alive, and it was feeding on me, on my fear, my confusion, my desperation. I had to escape. But how? The house was twisting around me, reshaping itself in ways I couldn't comprehend. Every path seemed to lead me deeper into its dark heart, and I was running out of time. I spun around, desperate for an exit, but the room had changed. The walls had shifted, the door I had entered through no longer there. I was trapped, a rat in a maze with no way out. And then, a voice. It was soft at first, a whisper from the shadows. "You were always meant to find the truth." I froze, my heart leaping in my chest. The voice. It was my mother's voice. It came from behind me, but when I turned around, no one was there. The room was empty, silent. But the voice continued, clearer now, echoing through the room. "You can't outrun it, Alex. You can't run from what you are, from what your family has done. The house knows. It always knows." The darkness around me seemed to deepen, the shadows growing long and twisted, crawling across the walls like living things. The mirror shimmered in the corner of my vision, but now it was different. It wasn't just a reflection anymore. It was something more, something dark. "You have to face it." The voice urged me again, more insistent this time. The walls of the room seemed to pulse with the rhythm of the heartbeat, and I could feel it in my chest, too, syncing with my own pulse. The house had become a part of me, its darkness creeping inside my soul. I took a step forward, moving closer to the mirror. The reflection of myself in the glass was still there, waiting. Its smile was wider now, almost mocking. It was me, but it wasn't. It was the version of me that had always existed in the shadows, the one I had been trying to escape my whole life. "You can't hide from who you are, Alex," the reflection hissed. "This house, it knows your deepest secrets, your darkest fears. You're not the first to come here, and you won't be the last. But you can change it. You can fix what's been broken." I didn't understand. What was it trying to tell me? What was broken? What had happened here? The heartbeat grew louder, deafening now, and I felt a sharp pain in my chest. It was as though the house was pulling me in, pulling my very soul into the darkness. Suddenly, everything went still. The heartbeat, the whispers, the shadows, everything stopped. And in that silence, the truth hit me like a wave. This house wasn't just a building. It was a prison. It was a place where the past could never be escaped. A place where memories were trapped, replaying over and over again. My family's tragedy, their mistakes, were locked within these walls, and I had been drawn here, not by chance, but by fate. It's time to remember. The voice was calm now, like a distant echo. The reflection in the mirror shifted once more, and I saw it, my father, my mother, standing together, their faces filled with fear and regret. They were not just victims of the house. They were complicit in its darkness. The house had found them, just as it was feeding on me now. It was their guilt, their pain, their unresolved secrets that had created this prison. And I had been drawn into it, whether I wanted to or not. I understood now. The house wasn't just trying to trap me, it was trying to make me part of it, to make me face the same choices they had faced. The same mistakes. The same fears. But there was something different about me. I wasn't like them. I wasn't going to let the house win. I took a deep breath, summoning every ounce of strength I had left. I turned away from the mirror, from the reflection of the man I had feared to become. I wasn't him. I wasn't them. I won't stay. The voice from the house seemed to scream, but I didn't listen. I knew the way out now. The house had shown me everything, every twisted turn, every hidden corner. It had laid out the truth before me, and now I had a choice. I ran. The house screamed as I tore through it, my footsteps echoing in the dark corridors, the walls groaning in protest. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I could feel the darkness reaching for me, but I wouldn't let it pull me in. I reached the front door, the one that had been locked, the one that had always been closed. My hand slammed against the doorknob, and it turned. I stepped out into the night, into the cold, crisp air. The house loomed behind me, silent, watching. But I was free. Free from its grasp, free from its secrets. For now. I didn't know what the future held, but I knew one thing: I had faced the truth. I had broken the cycle. And as I walked away from the house, I heard the whispers one last time. But this time, they were fading, growing weaker, until they were nothing more than a memory. And that was enough. It all started with a simple question. A question that never should have been asked. Did you sign this? I turned my head toward the voice, my eyes briefly glancing at the paper in front of me. It was one of those forms I dealt with regularly, one of those mundane pieces of office paperwork that hardly ever caused a stir. But today, it did. My heart skipped a beat when I saw it, my signature, unmistakable, right at the bottom of the page. But I hadn't signed it. I scanned the page, looking for some clue, some evidence that I could have signed it and forgotten. But there was nothing. The words were neatly typed, the ink of my signature bold and clear, but the memory of making that mark was absent. I had no recollection of it. I stared at the form longer, hoping my brain would catch up, that somehow the fog would lift and I'd remember the moment I placed my signature there. But the longer I stared, the more certain I became I had never signed this document. I would never forget something like this. Is everything all right, Emily? A colleague's voice interrupted my thoughts. David, one of the senior staff, stood nearby, holding a cup of coffee. His eyes glanced down at the paper in my hand before meeting my gaze. I didn't sign this, I said, my voice a little too shaky, a little too unsure. I didn't know why I was feeling like this. I had always been meticulous, always careful with my work. There was no way I could have signed it without remembering. David raised an eyebrow, walking over to the desk. Of course you did. I saw you do it yesterday, right after the meeting. You even mentioned something about getting it done before the end of the day. The words hit me like a slap, but I couldn't shake the certainty growing inside me. There was no way I had signed this. My hands had never touched this document until now. I had been at home last night, relaxing after the long workday, not sitting at my desk. Maybe I just forgot, I muttered, trying to convince myself. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. David didn't seem convinced. He looked at me curiously before turning back to his computer. Well, no big deal. Just make sure it's taken care of. The deadline's tight. As he walked away, my mind raced. I turned the document over and over in my hands, searching for something, anything that would make sense of it. I didn't sign this, but they all believed I did. I couldn't shake the feeling of unease that settled into my chest. It was as if something was watching me, something just beyond my reach, waiting for me to realize the truth. I tried to push the thought away, to focus on the task at hand, but every time I looked at that document, my eyes were drawn back to my signature. My mind felt clouded, my thoughts scattered. I stood up and walked out of the office, desperate for air, desperate for clarity. The office was still, a quiet hum of fluorescent lights overhead. The sound of distant keyboards tapping, the soft murmur of conversations from the break room, everything felt distant, muffled, as though I were underwater. I felt disconnected from the world around me, as though I were standing on the edge of something, teetering, waiting for the ground to fall out from under me. I walked through the halls, trying to clear my head, but the unease only grew stronger. I needed to talk to someone, to find out what was happening. But who could I trust? David had seen me sign the document. Everyone else would think I was just being paranoid. Then I noticed something strange. In the hallway, a figure passed by, someone I didn't recognize. They were walking quickly, their face obscured by a hood. I couldn't shake the feeling that they were watching me, following me. But when I turned to look, they had disappeared into the shadows. My pulse quickened. I told myself it was nothing, just my imagination. But I couldn't shake the sense that something was very wrong, something I couldn't see, but was closing in on me. I found myself outside the conference room where the meeting had taken place the day before. The door was slightly ajar. I pushed it open, stepping inside. The room was empty, but there was a faint smell in the air, something old and stale, as though it had been used for too long. I walked to the table, the chairs still neatly arranged from yesterday's discussion. I noticed the pile of papers on the corner of the table. A folder with a few scattered documents. I didn't know why, but I reached out and grabbed it, flipping it open. Inside, I found more forms, more documents, and a familiar name typed at the top of one of them. My name. I didn't remember signing this one either. A shiver ran down my spine. The same sinking feeling filled me. I had to get to the bottom of this. I couldn't ignore it anymore. As I flipped through the rest of the folder, I noticed something strange. A sticky note, barely visible under one of the papers. I peeled it back, and written in faint, smudged ink were two words. Watch her. My blood ran cold. My head spun. Who had left this message? Why had they written it here, in a place where I'd find it? The realization hit me like a ton of bricks. Something was going on, something far beyond a simple mistake. And I was caught right in the middle of it. I needed answers. I needed to know who was behind this, and why. But as I stood there, alone in the silent room, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was no longer in control. Something was pulling me in, deeper and deeper, and I had no idea who I could trust. I had to find out what was happening before it was too late. The drive home that evening was the longest I'd had in years. My mind kept replaying the events of the day, David's casual insistence that I had signed the document, the sticky note that I couldn't forget, and the strange, unfamiliar figure in the hallway. The feeling of being watched refused to leave me. I tried to rationalize it all. Maybe I was overthinking things. Maybe it was just the pressure of work catching up with me. But something gnawed at me from the inside, like a whisper I couldn't fully hear, but knew was there. As soon as I got home, I opened my laptop, determined to find any connection between the documents I'd seen earlier and the mystery that was unfolding around me. My fingers hovered over the keys as I considered where to start. My first instinct was to check through my emails, looking for anything out of the ordinary. I sifted through the usual work messages, meeting schedules, updates from HR, and project files, but nothing stood out. I wasn't sure what I was looking for, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it was somewhere hidden just beneath the surface. I paused for a moment and thought about the folder I'd found in the conference room. Something about it felt wrong, like it didn't belong there. I should have taken a closer look at the papers, but I had been too distracted by the sticky note. What if there was something I missed? I grabbed the folder I had brought home with me. The same documents, the same unsettling feeling. I started flipping through them again, but this time I examined each page carefully, searching for any small detail that didn't match up. And then, something caught my eye. It was a single line of text, buried within a report I didn't remember seeing earlier. It was a list of names, written in small, neat print. My name was at the top of the list. But below it was something I didn't expect, another name, someone I had never heard of before. Lena Harlow. I ran my finger over the name, repeating it under my breath. Nothing. No memory of the person, no connection at all. I quickly Googled her name, but found nothing, at least, nothing that was useful. There was a profile on LinkedIn, but it was bare. No picture, no details. Just a list of job titles with no real history. Something about her profile felt off, but I couldn't quite put my finger on it. My eyes flicked back to the report. The name was there again, under mine, on every page, silently mocking me. It was as if Lena Harlow had been there all along, lurking just beneath the surface. Suddenly, I felt the weight of it all. A part of me wanted to stop, to close the laptop, pretend none of this had ever happened. But I couldn't. I knew, deep down, that I was being pulled into something bigger than myself. Something I had to understand, even if it meant facing something terrifying. I leaned back in my chair, trying to calm my racing thoughts. Maybe I was just paranoid. Maybe this was all just a coincidence. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being manipulated, that someone had been playing me for much longer than I realized. I needed answers, and I needed them fast. The next day at work, I couldn't focus. My thoughts kept drifting back to the name Lena Harlow and the mysterious way it kept showing up. Around mid-morning, I found myself walking toward the break room. I needed a moment to clear my head, to think. But as I turned the corner, I froze. David was standing by the coffee machine, talking to someone. The conversation was too quiet for me to make out the words, but it didn't take much to recognize the second figure in the room. Lena Harlow. I stared at her, my heart pounding in my chest. She was standing just a few feet away, her back to me, talking to David. I couldn't make out the conversation, but I was sure of one thing: this woman had to be involved. Without thinking, I turned and walked away, my steps quick and erratic. My head was spinning, and for a moment, I couldn't breathe. Why hadn't I noticed her before? Why hadn't anyone mentioned her? I needed to speak to her. But as I walked back to my desk, I caught sight of her again. This time, she was walking toward the exit. She glanced at me briefly, as if she'd known I was watching, before disappearing out of view. My pulse raced. I couldn't let her slip away. I had to talk to her. I grabbed my coat and rushed out of the building. It wasn't until I was outside that I realized how much my hands were shaking. Where had she gone? I looked up and down the street, but there was no sign of her. Had I imagined it? Was she just another part of the strange, growing mystery that was consuming me? My phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out, distracted, and saw a new email notification pop up. The subject line was simple: urgent, signature issue on file. It was from HR. My heart skipped a beat as I clicked on the email. The message was brief, but the words hit me like a punch in the stomach. Please review the attached document. It seems there has been an error regarding the signed contract you submitted last week. We have not received your signature for approval. I felt dizzy. I couldn't breathe. This was the second time in as many days that someone was questioning my signature. Something was wrong. Terribly wrong. The pieces were starting to come together, but I wasn't sure if I wanted to know what they meant. I looked down at my phone again, trying to steady myself. And that's when I saw it, a new notification on my lock screen, a message from an unknown number. You're getting too close. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I slowly unlocked my phone, my hands trembling. The message was chilling. And it was clear. I wasn't going to be left alone. Not until I learned the truth. I stared at the message on my phone, my heart pounding in my chest. The words were short, but their impact was immediate and overwhelming. The voice in my head screamed to stop, to retreat, to let the mystery remain unsolved. But I couldn't. Something inside me refused to back down. I quickly typed a response, my fingers shaking. Who is this? But before I could hit send, the phone buzzed again. A new message popped up, this time with an attachment. I hesitated for a moment, then opened it. My breath caught in my throat as I saw the document. It was a file from a project I had worked on months ago, one I had nearly forgotten. It was a budget proposal, one I had never submitted. But there, at the bottom of the page, was my signature, clear and undeniable. I didn't remember signing it. In fact, I was sure I hadn't. But the proof was right in front of me. I felt the ground beneath me shift, and for a moment, I was lost. I was being manipulated, pulled into something I didn't understand. This wasn't just about a misplaced signature or a misunderstanding at work. There was a deeper game being played, and I was at the center of it. The phone buzzed again, snapping me out of my thoughts. Another message. You're getting too close. If you don't stop now, it won't just be your job at risk. My hands went cold as I read those words. A chill ran down my spine, and I felt the weight of the threat hanging over me. I wasn't just uncovering an office conspiracy. This was bigger. and the people behind it weren't afraid to go to extreme lengths to protect their secrets. I turned my attention back to the email from HR. They had attached a document titled Signature Verification, Signed Documents, and requested I look over it. The attachment was a list of signatures from various contracts. My name was on several of them, all from projects I had worked on months ago, yet I had no memory of signing them. I scanned the list, my pulse quickening as I realized something disturbing. The contracts were linked to people I didn't know, companies I'd never heard of. This wasn't just about a few signatures. This was about something much larger, something that had been going on behind my back for a long time. And now, I was in the thick of it. I slammed the phone down on the table, my mind racing. I needed to confront someone, anyone, who could help me make sense of all this. But I knew who I had to talk to. David. He had to know more. I grabbed my coat and rushed back to the office. My mind was a blur as I replayed the events, trying to find a pattern, a clue that would explain everything. But the more I thought about it, the more it seemed like I was spiraling, getting deeper into a maze I couldn't escape. When I arrived at the office, I walked straight to David's desk. He looked up in surprise, his expression unreadable. "David, I need to talk to you," I said, my voice trembling despite myself. He nodded, motioning for me to sit down. "Is something wrong?" he asked, his tone too calm for my liking. "I don't know," I said, sitting down across from him. "I keep finding my signature on things I didn't sign. Documents I didn't approve. Contracts tied to names I don't even recognize. And now, I've been getting anonymous messages telling me I'm getting too close to the truth." David's face remained impassive as he listened. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair and crossed his arms. "I don't know what to tell you," he said slowly. "Maybe you're just overwhelmed. You've been working a lot recently." "No," I said, shaking my head. "This isn't just stress. I'm not imagining things. Someone is framing me, manipulating my signature, making it look like I'm involved in things I don't understand." David stared at me for a long moment, and for the first time, I saw something flicker in his eyes, fear, maybe, or guilt. But whatever it was gone in an instant. "I think you need to take a step back," he said, his voice tight. "This is getting out of hand. Maybe you're just overthinking things." I stood up, frustration boiling inside me. Overthinking? No. I'm not crazy. I know something's wrong, and I need your help. David's gaze hardened. "I can't help you with this. If you want to get to the bottom of it, you'll have to figure it out yourself." I didn't know what to say to that. I was stunned, speechless. David had been my closest ally at work, someone I trusted. And now he was turning his back on me. But I knew something wasn't right, and if David wouldn't help me, then I would have to find another way to uncover the truth. I left his office and went straight to the security desk. My mind raced with thoughts of what to do next. I needed access to the security footage. I needed to see if anyone had tampered with the documents or if I had been set up somehow. I had to know who was behind all of this. But as I walked toward the security office, I was stopped in my tracks. There, standing in the hallway, was Lena Harlow. She was staring at me, her eyes cold and calculating. I froze. She smiled, just slightly, as if she had been waiting for me. "Looking for something?" she asked, her voice low and smooth. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. "What do you want?" Her smile widened. "I think you know exactly what I want. The question is, what do you want? I didn't answer her. Instead, I turned and walked away, my heart racing. I had no idea who she was, but I had a feeling she knew everything. And I was about to find out exactly what that meant. Lena's words echoed in my head as I hurried down the hallway, my mind a tangled mess of confusion and dread. What did she know? How much of this had she orchestrated? There was something about her, something unsettling, that made my skin crawl. I didn't know if I was being paranoid or if I was just starting to put the pieces together. But one thing was clear, the more I dug into this, the more I realized how deeply I was entangled in something far beyond my control. I reached the security office and knocked sharply on the door. A voice from inside called out, "Yeah?" I pushed the door open, my stomach twisted in knots. The security officer, Dan, looked up from his desk. He was a middle-aged man with a gruff face, and his eyes never seemed to meet yours for long. He'd been working at the company for years, and I had always seen him as someone who knew everything that happened within these walls. He always seemed reliable. But after everything that had happened, I wasn't so sure anymore. "I need to look at the footage," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "It's important." Dan eyed me warily, but didn't question me. All right. Come on in." He gestured for me to enter. I sat down next to him as he pulled up the monitor, typing in a password. My eyes were fixed on the screen, my heart hammering in my chest. "What are you looking for?" he asked, his fingers hovering over the keyboard. The day I signed those documents." "I need to see who was in the office at the time," I said. Just start with that morning." He clicked a few buttons, and the footage began to play. I watched closely, my breath shallow. At first, it seemed like a normal day, people walking in and out of the office, the usual office chatter. But as the footage continued, my anxiety grew. I couldn't see anything suspicious. No one seemed out of place. But then I noticed something strange. A few moments after I had walked into the office that morning, a figure passed by my desk, moving quickly and deliberately. The person was out of frame before I could fully make them out, but I knew instinctively that it wasn't anyone I recognized. It was almost as though they didn't belong. I leaned forward, my hands trembling. "Rewind that," I said, my voice tight. "Go back to the person who passed my desk." Dan glanced at me, then complied, rewinding the footage. When the person reappeared on the screen, I saw them clearly for the first time. They were wearing a dark hoodie, and their face was obscured by the shadows. I couldn't make out any distinguishing features. But I didn't need to. I knew that person was involved in what was happening to me. Dan didn't seem to notice the gravity of the situation. Just some random person, probably one of the contractors. What's the big deal? I leaned closer to the screen, ignoring him. The footage was too grainy, too distorted to tell that the figure was someone I knew, but the feeling in my gut told me they weren't. Whoever they were, they had been in the right place at the right time. And they knew something. I felt a surge of panic as I realized that someone had been watching me, had been planning this from the beginning. This wasn't just a case of bad luck or confusion, it was deliberate. Someone had been pulling strings, and I had no idea who. "Can you get me the footage for the last 2 weeks?" I asked, my voice barely steady. I need to know who else has been in the office at odd hours. Dan raised an eyebrow. "You sure about that? You're digging into some serious stuff here." "I'm sure," I said, my voice hardening. "Just give me the footage." Reluctantly, He began to search through the system. As the minutes ticked by, I could feel the tension building, the weight of the situation pressing down on me. My thoughts kept drifting back to Lena, her smile, her calm demeanor. She knew too much, and now I was starting to wonder if she was the one pulling the strings. Finally, Dan looked up from his screen. "All right, here we go. There's something odd about this." I stared at the screen as he pulled up footage from the last 2 weeks. It wasn't long before I saw something that made my stomach drop. Lena. She appeared in the footage several times, always in the same part of the building. She wasn't alone. In one clip, she was walking alongside a man I didn't recognize, their conversation too muffled to make out. They were discussing something urgently, glancing around as if making sure no one was watching. Another clip showed her entering the office late at night, just after I had left. But this time, she wasn't alone. The other person with her was carrying a briefcase, their face hidden beneath the shadow of a hat. But there was no mistaking it, Lena was meeting with someone. And they were discussing something they didn't want anyone to hear. I felt my blood run cold. This wasn't just an office issue. This was something much bigger, something far more dangerous. I turned to Dan, my voice shaky. "Can you enhance the audio on this clip? I need to hear what they're saying." Dan hesitated, his fingers hovering over the keyboard. "You sure you want to get into this? There's something weird going on here. Maybe you should just let it go." "I can't let it go," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "This is bigger than I thought. They're hiding something." Dan clicked a few keys, and the audio became clearer. Lena's voice echoed through the speakers, distorted but recognizable. "We're running out of time," Lena said in the clip. "We need to make sure she's framed properly. The documents have to go through before she realizes what's happening." The blood drained from my face. "Framed?" I whispered to myself. "What does that mean?" Suddenly, everything clicked into place. Lena wasn't just involved in the scheme. She was the one behind it all. She had set me up from the very beginning. The phone buzzed in my pocket again, pulling me out of my thoughts. I looked down at the screen. Another anonymous message. "You've seen enough. Don't dig any deeper. It's not worth it." I could feel the weight of the threat behind the words. But I knew one thing for sure, I couldn't stop now. Not while I was so close to uncovering the truth. My hands trembled as I stared at the message on my phone, my heart racing. The warning was clear, someone didn't want me to keep digging. The thought of backing down crossed my mind for a split second, but it was quickly replaced by a surge of determination. I had already uncovered too much to turn back now. I had to know the truth. Dan's eyes flicked nervously between me and the screen, and I could tell that he was getting uneasy. "You sure you want to push this further? This is starting to feel like a bad idea. People could get hurt." I didn't answer him. I couldn't. I was too absorbed in the footage, trying to piece together what Lena had said. Framed properly, documents, before she realizes. Before who realized? Me? I suddenly remembered the paperwork I had seen earlier, those documents with my signature. They hadn't been just any papers. I had been asked to sign them in a rush, with a vague explanation about standard procedures and company requirements. I never questioned it, never thought twice about it. But now I knew I had been manipulated into something I didn't understand. I stood up abruptly, my mind made up. I need to speak to Lena. Dan looked at me, a mixture of fear and concern in his eyes. You sure you want to confront her now? This could go south real fast. I ignored him, walking toward the door. The closer I got to Lena's office, the more the weight of the situation pressed down on me. Every step felt heavier than the last. I had no idea how deep this went or how far Lena would go to protect whatever it was she was hiding. When I reached her office, the door was slightly ajar, the faint sound of papers shuffling inside. I knocked once, then opened the door without waiting for a response. Lena was seated at her desk, her back to me. She didn't turn around immediately, and for a brief moment, I thought I had made a mistake. But then she spoke, her voice calm and collected. You've been looking into things, haven't you? I swallowed hard, trying to steady my nerves. I've seen the footage. I know what you're involved in. Lena finally turned in her chair, her expression unreadable. She didn't seem surprised. If anything, she looked almost relieved. I was hoping it wouldn't come to this, she said, her tone soft but laced with something cold. But I suppose you've reached the point where there's no going back. Why? I demanded. Why the documents? Why involve me in this? Lena sighed, her gaze drifting to the window as if searching for the right words. It was never meant to involve you. But sometimes things spiral out of control. People like you get caught up in the mess. And now it's too late to undo the damage. She stood up, walking slowly toward me. You weren't supposed to notice. You were just a pawn in a much bigger game. A pawn? I repeated, the realization hitting me like a slap to the face. You used me? Lena's lips curved into a faint smile. It's not personal. It's just business. I took a step back, anger bubbling up inside me. Business? You destroyed everything I've worked for, manipulated me into signing documents I didn't even read, and now you're telling me it's just business? She didn't flinch at my outburst. Instead, she looked almost pitying. You really think you can just walk away from this, don't you? You're in too deep now. The words echoed in my mind, sinking in with a terrible clarity. What's going to happen to me? I whispered, almost to myself. Lena's smile faded. That depends on how you play this. You can either keep digging and risk losing everything, or you can leave it alone and forget you ever saw anything. Your choice. I felt a cold wave of dread wash over me. She was giving me a choice, but I knew it was an illusion. There was no way out. I had already made my decision by trying to uncover the truth. Before I could respond, the door swung open behind me. I turned quickly, startled. A man stood there, someone I didn't recognize. He was tall, with sharp features, his eyes cold and calculating. I'm afraid the decision isn't entirely yours, he said in a voice that sent a chill down my spine. Lena, we need to talk. Lena's expression remained unchanged, but I saw a flicker of tension in her eyes. She stepped toward him, her demeanor completely shifting as if she were speaking to a superior, not a colleague. I understand, she said, her voice steady. But we'll need to deal with her first. The man didn't look at me. His eyes were fixed solely on Lena. We'll handle her after. It's getting messy, and I'm afraid we're running out of time. The room seemed to close in around me. I felt like I was standing at the edge of something much larger than I had ever anticipated. My heart pounded in my chest, and I instinctively took a step back, trying to keep my thoughts clear. But it was too late. The door clicked shut behind me with a finality that sent a shiver down my spine. I had been right. This wasn't just about a simple mistake or misunderstanding. I was trapped in a conspiracy, a game where I wasn't the player, I was the pawn. The truth was out there. But now, I wasn't sure if I'd be alive long enough to uncover the rest of it. How would you react if you received an invitation to a celebration only to find out that the sender was someone you didn't recognize? Someone you'd never even heard of? Would you go just to see where it leads, or would you dismiss it as a mistake? That was the question swirling in my mind when I found the envelope on my doorstep. It wasn't particularly unusual, except for the lack of a return address. The handwriting was elegant, yet unfamiliar. It had a kind of old-fashioned feel to it, as though it belonged in a different time. I picked it up with a sense of unease and slid my finger under the seal, tearing it open carefully. Inside, there was a single card. You are cordially invited to a celebration in honor of the legacy of the Whitmore family. Join us at 7 p.m. sharp. 213 Elmwood Avenue. You are an essential part of the story we're about to tell. Don't miss it. The words didn't make sense. Whitmore? I didn't know anyone by that name. I wasn't related to any Whitmore family, at least not to my knowledge. My curiosity piqued, but a deep sense of discomfort gnawed at my gut. Why me? What kind of celebration was this, and why was I invited? I stood there for a moment, the cool evening air tugging at my jacket. The thought of simply discarding the invitation crossed my mind, but something, perhaps the strange feeling in my chest, compelled me to accept. I couldn't shake the sense that something important was waiting for me there, something connected to my past, something I didn't yet understand. When I arrived at 213 Elmwood Avenue, the house looked ordinary enough. An old Victorian with ivy creeping up its walls, its windows dark, like eyes staring back at me in the quiet of the night. The street was eerily still, no sounds of distant cars or people walking by. Just an unsettling silence. I hesitated for a moment before approaching the front door. As I reached out to knock, the door swung open by itself. There was no one there to greet me, and the chill in the air made me shiver involuntarily. It was as though I had entered a world that didn't quite fit with the one I knew. "Hello?" I called out, my voice echoing in the empty hallway. No answer. The only sound was the soft creaking of the old house settling. I stepped inside, and the door shut behind me with a soft thud. I stood in the foyer for a moment, feeling a strange weight in the air, as though I had crossed into a place where time no longer worked the same way. A long table was set up in the next room, covered with plates of food and wine glasses. People milled about, talking in hushed voices. But there was an odd stillness to the gathering. No one looked at me when I entered. No one acknowledged my presence. I slowly walked further into the room, glancing at the unfamiliar faces around me. Some were older, some younger, but all seemed oddly familiar, as though I had seen them before in a dream or from an old photograph I couldn't place. And then I saw him. At the far end of the room, standing near a grand fireplace, was a man whose face I couldn't quite remember. But something about him felt important. His eyes met mine, and there was a flicker of recognition in them. "Ah, you've arrived," the man said, his voice smooth and deep. "We've been waiting for you." I blinked, taken aback. Waiting for me? He smiled, but it was the kind of smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Of course. You are the missing piece of the puzzle, after all. The one who holds the key to the past." My heart skipped a beat. I wasn't sure what he meant, but I felt an overwhelming pull toward him, like I had been drawn into something far larger than myself. The air seemed to grow heavier, charged with anticipation. "You'll find out soon enough," the man continued, his gaze unwavering. "Everything you've been searching for, everything you've been trying to remember, will be revealed tonight." As the words hung in the air, a sudden chill swept through the room and the lights flickered. I glanced around, noticing that the other guests had stopped talking. Their faces were now fixated on me, as though waiting for something to happen. "Who are you?" I asked, my voice trembling slightly. The man didn't answer immediately. Instead, he raised a hand toward the fireplace, and as if by some unseen force, the flames shifted. They flickered and swirled, forming shapes that seemed both familiar and strange at once. And then, the image became clear. A family portrait. My family. But there was something wrong with it. The faces were twisted, distorted, as if hidden memories were rising to the surface. The people in the photo were not just strangers, they were ghosts from the past, people I thought I had forgotten. Suddenly, I understood. This celebration wasn't for me, it was for my past, for the truth about my family that had been buried for so long. The Whitmore name, the legacy, it was all tied to me, to my own bloodline. And as the flames flickered out, I knew that nothing would ever be the same again. The room grew colder as the flames died down, leaving only a faint glow from the embers. My heart raced in my chest, but I couldn't look away from the image that had appeared. The family portrait burned into my mind, its haunting familiarity pulling at something deep within me. The faces of the people in the picture, they were so close, yet so far out of reach. The man near the fireplace watched me with intense eyes. His gaze was steady, as though he were waiting for my reaction, for the moment when I would finally understand. "You must have questions," he said, his voice barely a whisper, but it cut through the silence like a blade. I opened my mouth to speak, but no words came out. How could I possibly begin to ask about something so bizarre, so impossible? Who were these people? Why had I never heard of them before? And most importantly, why was I being shown this now? A strange feeling of vertigo swept over me. It was as if the walls of the room were closing in, and I was losing my grip on reality. I felt like a stranger in my own life, standing in a place that didn't belong to me but to someone I was supposed to know. The man continued, as though reading my thoughts. "This is where it all began. Your family's history, their secrets, hidden in plain sight for generations. You are the final piece of a long-forgotten story, and tonight, you will learn everything." The silence in the room pressed in around me. I tried to take a step back, but my legs felt like lead. The faces of the other guests were no longer obscured by the shadows. They were all staring at me, their eyes filled with expectation. They knew. They all knew what was happening, and I was the only one left in the dark. "You've been searching for answers," the man said, stepping closer. His face softened, almost with pity. "But the truth comes at a cost. It always does." My throat tightened. "What truth? What are you talking about?" "Your family, my dear, is not what you think it is." His words hung heavy in the air, and for a moment I thought I could hear the faintest whisper of a voice, familiar, but distant. "They've hidden the truth from you for years. But now, it's time to confront it." A cold shiver ran down my spine. The room felt even colder now, as though the temperature had dropped several degrees. The other guests remained motionless, but their eyes were locked on me, following my every move. I could hear the faint rustle of fabric as one of them shifted their weight. Suddenly, I felt the need to leave. The oppressive atmosphere in the room was suffocating. But as I turned to the door, it slammed shut with a deafening bang. The sound echoed throughout the house, the force of it making my heart leap into my throat. The man smiled. "It's too late to leave now. The past has found you, and you must face it." Before I could react, he gestured to the corner of the room where a large, ornate mirror stood. The mirror's surface was dark, but it seemed to pulse with a strange energy, as though something was trapped inside it, begging to be released. I didn't want to look. I didn't want to face whatever was inside that mirror, but my feet moved of their own accord. Slowly, hesitantly, I approached it, my reflection faintly visible in the glass, distorted by the swirling patterns of light and shadow. And then I saw it. A figure, barely visible at first, began to take shape in the mirror. At first, it was only a shadow, a movement in the corner of my vision. But as I stared, it became clearer, more defined. It was me. But not quite. The reflection was wrong. My face looked twisted, distorted, as though someone else was wearing my skin. And behind the reflection, I saw them, the faces from the portrait. They were standing just behind me, their eyes empty, staring at me with an unsettling intensity. I stumbled back, my breath caught in my throat. No. This isn't real. This can't be real. The man stepped closer, his voice soft but full of finality. "Oh, but it is. This is who you are. This is your family, your legacy. You're not who you think you are." The world seemed to tilt, and I grasped for something to steady myself. But there was nothing. The air grew thick, the walls pressing in around me as the faces in the mirror crowded closer, their forms becoming more solid, their expressions more menacing. "What do you want from me?" I choked out, my voice barely audible over the pounding of my heart. The man smiled, his eyes glinting with something dark, something ancient. "The truth, my dear. The truth always demands its toll. And now, you must pay it." And then, before I could react, the mirror shattered. I woke up in my own bed, drenched in sweat. My heart raced, and the remnants of the dream clung to me like a shadow, refusing to let go. I glanced around, disoriented. The room was familiar, the soft light of morning spilling through the window. Had it been a dream? Was it all just a nightmare? I ran a hand through my hair and tried to steady my breathing. But then I saw it, the invitation, sitting on my nightstand. The same card. The same invitation I had received the night before. And it was signed with a name I had never seen before. Whitmore. The truth was waiting for me, and I knew it wasn't over yet. The nightmare was only just beginning. I could feel my hands trembling as I reached for the card on the nightstand. The name Whitmore seemed to burn into the surface of my mind. My fingers brushed against the cold, smooth paper, and I hesitated for a moment before flipping it over. There, on the back, was something I hadn't noticed before, an address, written in elegant script. A date. And a single sentence beneath it. "The past never truly lets go." I stared at the words, the meaning sinking in like a weight pressing against my chest. What did it mean? Why was this happening? I hadn't wanted any part of this family history, this mystery. Yet, the past was catching up to me, slowly, methodically, like a shadow I couldn't escape. I closed my eyes and took a deep breath. There had to be an explanation for all of this. A reasonable explanation. This couldn't be real. I couldn't be involved in something so dark, so strange. And yet, I knew that denying it wouldn't make it go away. The invitation had been clear. The man in the house, the distorted reflection in the mirror, they were part of something bigger than me. Something I had been born into, whether I wanted to or not. I had to know the truth. With a trembling hand, I grabbed my phone and entered the address on the card into the GPS. It led me to a place far from the city, out into the quiet countryside. The area was secluded, far enough from civilization to feel abandoned. It was as if the world had forgotten about this place, and yet I had to go there. The drive was long, the roads winding and unfamiliar. My mind raced, replaying every moment from the night before, but the more I thought about it, the more confused I became. The faces in the mirror, who were they? What did they want from me? And why did they look so much like me? The GPS guided me down a narrow dirt road, the trees closing on either side, their twisted branches reaching toward the sky like fingers grasping at the air. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the path. I didn't know what I expected, but I certainly didn't expect what I found. The house was nothing like I had imagined. It was massive, an old mansion that seemed to have been abandoned for years. The paint was chipped, the windows cracked. It loomed in the distance, its silhouette stark against the fading light of day. But despite its disrepair, there was something strangely inviting about it, something that made my heart beat faster as I approached. As I parked in front of the house, the eerie silence of the place settled over me like a heavy blanket. The front door was open, just slightly ajar, as though someone had been waiting for me. I took one last breath, trying to steady my nerves. The invitation had been clear, but now that I was here, I wasn't sure what to expect. What had I gotten myself into? I stepped out of the car and walked toward the entrance, my footsteps echoing in the stillness. As I reached the door, I hesitated, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. Something wasn't right. And then I heard it. A faint whisper. A voice, soft and distant, almost like a lullaby. It was too faint to make out, but it felt like it was coming from inside the house. I froze, straining to listen, but the sound stopped as suddenly as it had started. Was it my imagination? Had I really heard something? The door creaked open slightly more as if inviting me inside. I couldn't turn back now. Whatever was waiting for me, I had to face it. Steeling myself, I stepped into the house. The air inside was thick, heavy with dust and the scent of something long forgotten. The walls were lined with old portraits, paintings of people I didn't recognize, but their eyes seemed to follow me as I moved through the hall. The floorboards groaned under my weight, each step sending a ripple through the silence. I walked deeper into the house, my heartbeat quickening with every passing second. The whispers had stopped, but the feeling of being watched hadn't. I was no longer alone. At the end of the hallway, I saw a dim light coming from beneath the door. It was ajar, and from within, I could hear the faint sound of voices, low, indistinct murmurs that blended together in a way that almost seemed unnatural. I approached slowly, my breath shallow. The door creaked open as I pushed it, and what I saw inside took my breath away. The room was filled with people, guests, just like the night before. But this time, it wasn't a dream. It was real. They sat around a large table, their faces pale, their eyes lifeless, staring straight ahead as if waiting for something. And at the head of the table, sitting like a king, was the man I had seen before. He didn't acknowledge me, but his eyes were locked on mine, as though he had been expecting me all along. "Ah, you've arrived," he said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. We've been waiting for you." I stood frozen in the doorway, unable to move. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the table, from the people seated there, all so still, so motionless. They were all staring at me, but it wasn't just their eyes I felt. There was something more, a presence, a pull, something I couldn't explain. And then, one of the guests spoke. "Welcome to the family," they said, their voice a hollow echo that sent a chill down my spine. I stumbled backward, my heart racing. I needed to get out of there. But before I could move, the door slammed shut behind me. The room went dark, and the whispers began again. I couldn't breathe. The darkness was suffocating, wrapping around me like a thick, invisible fog. The whispers grew louder, swirling around me in a maddening dance of voices. They were familiar, though I couldn't place them. They didn't seem to come from the people in the room, but from somewhere deeper, somewhere older. My heart hammered in my chest as I fumbled for my phone in my pocket, the glow of the screen providing the only light in the suffocating darkness. As I turned it on, the faint light illuminated the room just enough for me to see the faces, twisted, pale, and empty-eyed. They were still sitting around the table, unblinking, as if time had stopped for them. "Who are you?" I managed to whisper, my voice trembling, lost in the heavy silence. The man at the head of the table didn't move. But his eyes, the same eyes that had haunted me in the mirror, glinted in the dim light. I could see now, with a sickening clarity, that he was smiling, his lips curling into an eerie grin that didn't fit the lifeless atmosphere of the room. "You don't remember, do you?" he said, his voice smooth, almost like silk. "No matter. The past has a way of catching up with those who try to forget." His words struck me like a blow to the gut. A rush of memories flashed through my mind, flickers of faces, places I couldn't quite recall, fragments of a life I thought I had left behind. I stepped back, nearly tripping over the edge of the table as I fought to control my breathing. Something was terribly wrong here, something that went deeper than I could understand. "I don't know what you're talking about," I stammered, but even as the words left my lips, I knew they were lies. There was too much about this place, about these people, that felt wrong. The room seemed to close in on me, the walls pressing inward as if the house itself was alive, breathing with me. I could feel my skin crawling, my body trembling in the thick, oppressive air. "You will," the man said softly. "In time. Just remember, the invitation was never meant to be a choice." I froze. My mind raced, trying to piece together the puzzle. The invitation, the strange card, the whispers in the house, it was all tied together, all part of some family secret, something buried deep within my own bloodline. The air seemed to shift suddenly, the temperature dropping as a gust of wind blew through the cracked windows, stirring the dust that had settled in the corners of the room. It wasn't the wind from outside, no, it was something different. Something unnatural. I turned to leave, but the door wouldn't budge. I pulled at the handle, desperate to escape, but it was locked, the metal cold and unyielding beneath my fingers. The room began to spin, the shadows dancing around me like living creatures. "You're not going anywhere," the man's voice echoed, louder now, reverberating off the walls. "Not until you remember." I staggered back, my mind unraveling, the past finally catching up with me in a flood of images, memories, and sensations. Faces I didn't recognize, but they were familiar. And then, like a jolt of electricity, it hit me. The truth. This wasn't just a random gathering. It wasn't a celebration. This was a reckoning. A family reunion of sorts, one that had been set into motion long before I had ever stepped foot in that house. I remembered the stories my parents used to tell me, the old family legends, the whispered warnings, the rumors about the Whitmore family and their connections to strange rituals, dark deals, and lost legacies. But it had all seemed like superstition, folklore passed down through generations. I had never believed it until now. The man at the table wasn't just a stranger. He was part of my family, a distant relative, someone I had never met, someone who had been waiting for this moment. I backed away from the table, my mind reeling. The faces of the guests, all of them, had shifted. They weren't just staring at me anymore. They were watching, observing, as if waiting for me to understand. "You don't belong here," I muttered, my voice cracking. "This isn't my family." "You are mistaken," the man said softly. "You are more connected to this place than you realize. You've always belonged here, you just didn't know it. Your blood runs through these walls, through these doors. And now, you're part of the story." The truth hung in the air like a heavy fog, choking me with its weight. The truth was that I was a part of something darker than I had ever imagined, a legacy of secrets, hidden rituals, and a family bound together by blood and guilt. I looked around, my eyes searching for some way out. There had to be a way out. But the room was closing in, the walls pressing against me as the whispers grew louder, more insistent. It felt like the house itself was trying to swallow me whole, trapping me in its grip. I was part of this legacy, whether I liked it or not. The past was no longer something I could escape. The man's voice cut through my thoughts, sharp and clear. "You can't run from it. You've been summoned, and now you will face what your ancestors never had the courage to confront." I tried to scream, but no sound came out. The darkness swallowed me whole. The world around me began to spin, the walls blurring, the shadows pressing closer. The whispers filled my ears, drowning out everything else. They weren't just voices, they were memories. My memories resurfacing like ghosts from the past. I tried to breathe, but the air was thick, suffocating. The coldness of the room seeped into my bones, and I could feel it, something ancient, something evil, watching me, waiting for me to accept what had been set into motion. I took a step back, my legs unsteady, but my mind clear. This wasn't just a family secret. It was a curse, one passed down through generations, one that had finally caught up with me. "You can't escape," the man said again, his voice echoing in the suffocating silence. "You're part of this now." The invitation was just the beginning. I looked at the people around me, the family members I had never known existed. Their faces were pale, expressionless, their eyes fixed on me with an intensity that was almost too much to bear. It felt like they were waiting for me to make a decision, but what decision was there to make? What could I possibly do to escape this? Suddenly, I felt something shift within me, like a door creaking open in my mind. The memories, my memories, began to flood in faster now, overwhelming me. I saw my parents, their faces kind but distant. I saw the years of silence, the stories they had kept hidden from me, the lies they had told to protect me. And then, I saw it, the moment they had warned me about, the one I had tried so hard to forget. The family ritual. It was real. The night I had been born, the night I had been marked by the blood of my ancestors, was the night they had sealed my fate. I was never meant to escape it. I was always meant to return. "You have a choice," the man's voice cut through my thoughts, and I looked at him, my heart pounding in my chest. "You can join us, embrace your place in this family, or you can walk away. But know this, the choice you make will echo through the generations. His words hung in the air, a terrible promise. There was no escaping this, no undoing what had been done. But I had to choose. I had to make a decision, even if it meant accepting something I wasn't ready for. I looked at the door again. It was still locked. There was no way out. But there was one thing I could control. My fate. I stepped forward, my heart racing, and said the words I never thought I would speak. I choose to walk away. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. The faces around me, once so cold and distant, seemed to shift. The man at the head of the table stood, his eyes narrowing, a twisted smile curling at the corners of his lips. "You can't walk away," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "You are already too far gone." The room around me began to tremble, the walls shaking, the floor beneath me vibrating as if the house itself was alive. The shadows seemed to grow, swirling around me, suffocating me with their darkness. I tried to move, to run, but my legs wouldn't respond. I was trapped. Suddenly, the whispers stopped. A deep, menacing silence filled the room, and I felt a presence behind me, cold, heavy, and unmistakable. I turned slowly, my breath caught in my throat. Standing behind me was a figure. A woman. Her face was pale, her eyes black as coal, her lips parted in a silent scream. It was her. My mother. Her face was twisted with sorrow and regret, her eyes filled with a pain so deep it felt as though it would tear me apart. She reached out to me, her hand trembling as she touched my cheek. The coldness of her touch burned through my skin. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I never wanted this for you." Tears filled my eyes as I took a step back, my heart breaking. I had spent my whole life believing that my parents had been normal, loving people. But now I knew the truth. They had been part of something terrible, something I couldn't escape. I turned back to the man at the table. "What happens now?" "You will join us," he said, his voice final. "You will accept your place in this family, and the curse will be passed on. You will carry the legacy of your ancestors, whether you want to or not." The room seemed to close in around me, the walls tightening, the shadows growing. But even in the face of the darkness, something stirred inside me. A faint flicker of defiance. A spark of the person I had been before all this started. I turned away from them. I couldn't stay. I couldn't let this be my fate. I closed my eyes, focusing on that one flicker of hope inside me, and I ran. I ran as fast as I could, ignoring the pain, ignoring the voices calling out to me. The door was still locked, but I didn't stop. I kept running, my heart pounding in my chest. And then, finally, there it was. A light. A sliver of light cutting through the darkness. I burst through the door, my breath ragged, my body trembling. And as I stepped into the light, I heard one last whisper. "You can never truly escape." And with that, everything went dark. When I awoke, I was lying in my own bed. The sunlight was pouring through the window, and for a moment, I wondered if it had all been a dream. But as I sat up and looked around, I saw the invitation on my desk. It was real. And I knew, no matter how far I ran, no matter how much time passed, I would never be free of the legacy that haunted me. The choice had been made. And the story, for better or worse, had only just begun. It's strange how the smallest thing can awaken a memory, something buried so deep that you forgot it was even there. But that's what happened the other day when I saw the child playing with a key in the yard. It wasn't just any key. It was an old, rusted thing, worn and weathered, but it looked exactly like the one I had lost when I was a kid. The key I hadn't seen in years. I stood there for a long moment, watching the child swing it around in their small hand, completely unaware of the shock it sent through me. There was something familiar in the way the child held it, as if it had always belonged there. As if that key, now in their hands, was meant to be found. I was frozen for a while, staring at the key, but my thoughts began to spiral. How could this child have it? How did it get to them? And why was it stirring something inside of me that I had long since buried? The yard was quiet, save for the sound of the child's laughter. The sun was low in the sky, casting long shadows across the yard, and for a moment everything seemed oddly still. Time itself seemed to be holding its breath. I walked over, almost involuntarily, my heart pounding harder with each step. The child looked up as I approached, their expression blank and innocent. They didn't seem surprised or scared, just expectant. "Where did you find that?" I asked, my voice sounding distant even to my own ears. The child didn't answer immediately. Instead, they just held the key out toward me. It was as if they knew I would understand, or that they were waiting for me to take it from them. I took it in my hand, feeling its coldness seep into my skin. It was heavy, weightier than I remembered. I couldn't shake the feeling that this key was part of something much bigger than just a forgotten childhood trinket. "Do you know what it unlocks?" I asked the child, but they only smiled and shook their head. It was a smile too knowing, too eerie for such a young face. Without thinking, I turned and walked toward the shed at the edge of the yard. The key seemed to pull me, as if it were tethered to something in the past, something that was waiting. I'd never considered the old shed a place of mystery, but now, with the key in my hand, everything felt different. The door was locked, just like I remembered, but the key fit perfectly into the lock. I felt a strange rush of fear and anticipation as I turned it, the click of the lock breaking the silence. Inside, the air was thick and stale. Dust floated in the beams of fading light, and everything smelled like old memories, like things long forgotten. I stepped in cautiously, my eyes scanning the shelves and corners. And then, I saw it. My old things. My childhood toys, a broken tricycle, an old baseball glove, things I hadn't thought about in years. They were piled up in the back corner of the shed, as if they had just been left there, abandoned in time. My heart skipped a beat as I moved closer, my fingers brushing against the objects. It was like stepping into a past that had been sealed away, forgotten by everyone but me. I reached out and picked up a small, weathered photo album, its leather cover cracked and worn. As I flipped it open, the familiar faces of my family stared back at me. But there was something off about the photos, something that didn't feel right. I turned the pages slowly, the faces getting older, the memories slipping further into the past. But as I reached the last page, I froze. There, staring back at me, was a picture I didn't recognize. It was of a child, me, I assumed, but something was different. The surroundings were unfamiliar, and there was a shadow in the background, lurking just beyond the edges of the frame. I could almost hear the echo of footsteps in the distance, a chill creeping down my spine. I slammed the album shut, my breath coming faster. The key was still in my hand, cold as ice, and I could feel something pulling me further into the shed, urging me to look deeper. There was more. I could sense it. Something I wasn't ready to confront. The air around me seemed to grow colder, the shadows lengthening, and the quiet, innocent space that had once been my childhood sanctuary now felt like a trap. Something was wrong here. Something had been hidden in this shed for far too long. And the key, the one thing that had unlocked all of it, was the only thing keeping me tethered to this nightmare. I backed toward the door, the weight of the key in my hand growing heavier. That's when I heard it. A faint rustling from the back corner of the shed. The sound of movement. Of something or someone shifting in the shadows. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. I wasn't alone. I had never been alone. The key slipped from my hand and clattered to the floor, but it was too late. The door slammed shut behind me, the sound of the lock clicking into place louder than my own breath. I spun around, but the shadows were already closing in. This shed was more than just a storage space for old things. It was a place where memories were kept, memories that weren't meant to be uncovered. And now, I was part of those memories. The key had brought me here. But now, it was time to face the truth. Something from my past was coming for me. Something I couldn't escape. And I had no choice but to confront it. I woke up the next morning with a heavy feeling in my chest, as though something had shifted while I was asleep. The weight of the previous day's events lingered in the air, almost suffocating me, but I tried to shake it off. Maybe it was just the weird dreams, or maybe the old shed had just stirred up memories I wasn't ready to face. But no matter how hard I tried, my mind kept returning to the key. I tried to ignore the unsettling sense that I was on the edge of something I couldn't control. My head ached from the restless sleep, and the day stretched ahead like an empty void. But then, as I walked to the kitchen, there was an envelope waiting on the counter. It wasn't anything special at first glance, just a plain white envelope, unmarked except for my name written in elegant script. I felt my heart skip a beat, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. There was something about the envelope that felt wrong, like it didn't belong here, in my home. I picked it up, my fingers trembling, and carefully tore it open. Inside was a single card. It wasn't a letter, not even a note. Just a card with a golden border, and in the center, in the same elegant script as before, was an invitation. You are cordially invited to celebrate the anniversary of the Wicker family. A celebration of the past, the present, and the future. It was signed simply, the Wicker family. I stared at the card, confused. The Wicker family? I didn't know anyone by that name. The name didn't ring any bells, and I certainly hadn't received any invites to a celebration, let alone something as formal as this. The weight in my chest returned. I couldn't shake the feeling that I should recognize the name, or that I had heard it before. I turned the card over, hoping to find more information, but it was blank. I put the card down on the kitchen counter and ran a hand through my hair, trying to clear my thoughts. This had to be some kind of mistake. Maybe a wrong address or an invitation sent to the wrong person. But there was something about it that felt deliberate, as though it was meant for me. As though I had no choice but to attend. I tried to brush it off, focusing instead on the mundane things I had to do, breakfast, work, the usual routine. But as the day went on, the invitation never left my mind. I couldn't stop thinking about it, especially as the hours slipped by. By evening, I found myself pacing back and forth in my living room, my mind racing. Should I go? Should I ignore it? It seemed strange, too strange to just dismiss, but I couldn't think of a reason to go. After all, I had no connection to this family, and it didn't make sense. Yet, a part of me, some deep instinct, was telling me that I had to attend, that there was something waiting for me there, something I couldn't escape. I felt the weight of the key in my pocket, a reminder of what I had discovered in the shed. It was all connected. I was sure of it. The key, the invitation, the memories that had started flooding back. It was all pulling me towards something, whether I wanted it or not. I grabbed my coat and left the apartment without thinking, my steps quick and determined. As I walked toward the address printed on the card, a sense of dread settled in my stomach. The streets were quieter than usual, as though the world itself was holding its breath. I turned the corner and saw the house at the end of the street. It wasn't a large mansion or anything grand. In fact, it looked like any old house, modest, ordinary, even. But something about it made me stop in my tracks. It was almost as if the house itself was waiting for me. The windows were dark, the yard empty. There was no sign of life, no cars in the driveway, nothing. It was as if the world outside had forgotten about this place. I walked up the path, feeling the weight of every step, until I reached the door. I raised my hand and knocked, the sound echoing through the silence. A moment passed before the door creaked open, revealing a figure standing in the doorway. The person was tall, their face hidden in shadow, their features obscured by the darkness. "You've come," the voice said, low and welcoming. It was neither warm nor cold, but the tone was familiar, as though I had heard it before, though I couldn't place where. "I don't know why I'm here," I said, my voice sounding strangely distant, as if it wasn't mine at all. I just received an invitation." The figure stepped back, allowing me inside. "Come in. It's time for you to understand." I hesitated, but something, maybe the pull of curiosity or the feeling that I was already too far gone to turn back, pushed me through the door. Inside, the house was dark, save for the soft glow of candles casting long, flickering shadows across the walls. The air smelled faintly of something old, something forgotten, and I felt the unease in my chest grow stronger. The door closed behind me with a finality that made my breath catch in my throat. It was too late now. "Follow me," the figure said, turning away without another word. I obeyed, my steps echoing in the silence as I followed them down a narrow hallway. The further we walked, the darker the house seemed to become, until the only light came from the flickering candles along the walls. The silence was overwhelming. I couldn't hear my own breathing. The house was so still, as though it was holding its breath too. We stopped in front of a door at the end of the hall. The figure turned to me, their face still hidden in shadow. "This is where it begins," they said. "The Wicker family has been waiting for you." The door creaked open, and I stepped inside, my heart pounding. The room was small, dimly lit, with walls lined with old photographs and portraits in faded gold frames. The air was thick with dust, the kind that had settled over the years, undisturbed. There was a large wooden table in the center, covered with papers, old books, and more photographs. At the far end of the room, a fireplace flickered with a low, orange glow, casting eerie shadows on the walls. I stepped forward, my shoes making no sound on the old, creaky floorboards. The figure didn't follow me in. Instead, they stayed by the door, watching me silently. The heavy, oppressive silence in the room seemed to grow heavier with each passing second. My eyes scanned the room, trying to make sense of everything. But nothing made sense. The photographs on the walls, portraits of families and children, some in black and white, some in color, were all unfamiliar to me, but there was something hauntingly familiar about the faces. It was as if they were echoes of a past I couldn't remember. I walked over to the table, drawn to a large photo album sitting there. Its leather cover was cracked, worn with age. I opened it slowly, flipping through the pages. Each photograph seemed to tell a story, an old family gathering, a wedding, children playing in a garden, but none of the faces looked familiar. I stopped on one page, my fingers trembling as I traced the photo. It was a family portrait, much like the others, but one figure stood out to me. There, in the center of the group, was a woman with dark hair and eyes, her features sharp and striking. She was smiling, but there was a darkness in her eyes that sent a chill down my spine. She looked like me. I slammed the album shut, my breath catching in my throat. The resemblance was uncanny. The woman in the photograph had the same face, the same posture, the same expression. But how? How could that be possible? I stumbled back, my mind reeling, the room spinning around me. What was happening? What was all of this? "That's your grandmother," a voice said, suddenly breaking the silence. The figure at the door stepped into the room, now illuminated by the light of the fireplace. I turned toward them, my heart racing. "What do you mean, my grandmother?" I don't have a grandmother like this. I don't know these people." The figure stepped forward, and for the first time, their face came into view. It was a woman, older, but still striking. Her eyes were sharp, and there was something cold in her gaze. "You don't remember, do you?" she asked softly. "That's the trouble with people like you. You forget what you're meant to remember." I stared at her, confusion and fear swirling in my mind. "What are you talking about? Who are you? What is all of this?" The woman's lips curled into a faint smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. "I am someone you knew long ago. Someone who knew your family. Someone who knew the truth." I took a step back, my pulse pounding in my ears. "The truth? What truth? What are you hiding from me?" The woman's smile faded, and she walked over to the table, her hand brushing over the photographs with a gentle touch. "Your family's past is not what you think. It's not what you were told. There are things you've forgotten. Things that were hidden from you for your own protection." I shook my head, still unable to make sense of her words. "This is crazy. You're telling me that these people, these strangers, are my family? And what do you mean, hidden from me?" The woman turned to face me, her eyes locking onto mine. "Your grandmother, the one in the photo, was part of something dangerous. A secret passed down through generations. Your family was involved in it. And you were meant to carry it on." I felt my stomach twist in knots. "What secret? What are you talking about? I don't even know these people. I never asked for any of this." The woman's expression softened, but there was no warmth in it. "You never asked, but you were born into it. You've always been part of it, whether you remember it or not. This family's legacy is not just blood, it's power, it's history, it's control. And now, it's time for you to take your place." I took another step back, my hands shaking. "I don't want any part of this. I don't know what you're trying to pull, but I won't be a part of some family secret or conspiracy. I'll leave." The woman's eyes darkened. "You think you can leave? You think you have a choice in this? There are forces at play here far beyond your understanding. You're already part of this. It's too late to turn back now." Her words hit me like a slap, but there was something chilling in her tone, something that made me doubt my own instincts. I had no idea who she was or what she was talking about, but I knew one thing for certain: I had to get out of there. But as I turned to leave, the door slammed shut, the sound echoing through the house like a gunshot. I tried the handle, but it wouldn't budge. Panic surged through me. What's happening? What do you want from me? I shouted, my voice desperate. The woman stood in front of me now, blocking my way. Her face was calm, eerily calm. I want you to understand, finally. Your family's past cannot be escaped. It is part of you. You are part of it. I backed away, my chest tightening. No. I won't stay here. I won't be part of whatever this is. The woman's smile returned, but it was colder now. You will. Because you have no choice. And just like that, the world seemed to shift again. I felt the walls closing in, the air growing thicker, as though the house itself was suffocating me. The truth, whatever it was, seemed just out of reach, but it was waiting, pulling me closer, whether I was ready or not. I could feel the sweat trickling down my back, my hands clammy and cold. The room around me seemed to close in, the walls growing smaller, the air heavier. I was trapped. There was no way out. The woman's cold eyes followed my every movement, her presence a suffocating weight. You don't understand, do you? She asked, her voice now soft, almost soothing, like the calm before a storm. It's all connected. The house, the family, the secret. You think you can just walk away, but it's in your blood. It's in your history. I swallowed hard, my throat dry. What is this? What secret are you talking about? You're not making any sense. I don't even know who you are. Her smile faded as she stepped closer. The air grew colder, and a faint whisper seemed to echo from the walls, like a memory trying to resurface. You were never meant to forget, she said, her voice now low and intense. The family secret was always meant to be passed down to you. It's why you're here. Why you came. I shook my head, desperate for clarity. No. This doesn't make sense. I never asked for any of this. I just got an invitation. I don't know you. I don't know anyone here. I don't know why I'm here. The woman's expression softened, but there was no warmth in it. You came because you had to. You had to face the truth. You had to confront what's been hidden from you. Your family's legacy is waiting for you. Her words hit me like a jolt of electricity, my heart racing as the realization began to settle in. There was something familiar about this place. Something about the photographs, the old furniture, the smell of the room, it all felt oddly connected. I turned away from her, my mind spinning, trying to make sense of the fragments of my thoughts. I needed answers. Why me? I asked, my voice shaking. Why am I the one who has to know? Why didn't you tell me this before? The woman stepped forward, her eyes never leaving mine. Because you were never ready. You've lived your life unaware, living the lie your family built around you. But now, it's time for you to face the truth. Your grandmother, she was part of something much bigger than you ever realized. She was part of a pact. A pact that's been passed down through generations. I stepped back, my mind struggling to process the words she was saying. A pact? What kind of pact? Her gaze hardened. A pact that binds your family to something ancient. Something dangerous. It's a promise made long ago, one that has to be fulfilled. And you're the one who has to complete it. The weight of her words settled heavily on my chest. A promise? A pact? What could she be talking about? Why? Why would my family be involved in something like that? I asked, my voice trembling. The woman's lips curled into a faint, cryptic smile. Your family was chosen. Chosen to carry out a legacy that's older than you can imagine. A legacy that's been hidden from you for your own safety. Until now, I felt a sharp chill run through me. You're saying that all of this is real? This isn't some kind of twisted joke? She nodded solemnly. This is real. And now it's your turn to take your place in it. My head was spinning. I felt as though the ground beneath me was shifting, warping, as though nothing in this house was what it seemed. My hands gripped the table, trying to steady myself as I struggled to hold on to some semblance of reality. I don't want any part of this, I said firmly, though the words felt weak as they left my mouth. I didn't ask for this. I don't even know these people. I want to leave. I need to leave. The woman's smile returned, but it was cold, calculating. You can't leave, not now. You've already crossed the threshold. There's no turning back. I stepped back, my mind racing, looking for an escape, some way to get out of this nightmare. The doors were locked, and the windows, as I now noticed, were sealed tight. There was no way out. What do you want from me? I asked, my voice cracking. Why am I here? What do you need from me? The woman's gaze softened, but it was still laced with something dark. What we need from you is simple, your acceptance. Your willingness to carry on the legacy. To continue the pact. I felt my stomach churn at the thought. The legacy. The pact. These were words I couldn't grasp, but I felt their weight on my shoulders, as if I were being pulled into something much bigger than myself. Suddenly, the room seemed to grow darker, the walls closing in, the air thicker. The quiet whispering from the walls had returned, growing louder, filling the space with a strange, haunting hum. My heart pounded in my chest, and I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. Why is it so cold? I muttered, my breath coming in quick gasps. The woman's eyes glinted. Because it's almost time. Time for you to embrace your true heritage. As her words hung in the air, I felt a sudden pull, as if something inside me was awakening, something I had been denying for so long. I didn't know what it was, but I knew it had to do with the family, with the pact, whatever it was. A low, guttural sound suddenly filled the room, like a growl coming from deep within the walls, and I froze. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to shift, growing darker, taking on shapes that didn't belong. Do you hear that? I whispered, my voice barely audible. The woman nodded slowly, her eyes now wide with anticipation. It's the calling. The call of your family's past. The legacy is awakening. And then, in that moment, I knew. I was no longer a stranger in this house. This place, these people, they were part of me. Whether I wanted it or not. The sound grew louder, echoing in the room. The low, rumbling growl turned into a deep, guttural hum that vibrated through the walls. It wasn't just a noise, it was a presence, a force that was slowly filling the space, curling around me like smoke. I could feel it seeping into my bones, into my very soul. The woman was no longer in front of me. I didn't even notice when she had moved away, but I could sense her now, behind me, standing just out of sight. Her presence felt like a shadow stretching over me, wrapping around my thoughts. You have to understand, her voice came from behind me, echoing in my head. This isn't just a story. It's your story. This house, this legacy, it all belongs to you now. There's no escaping it. I turned quickly, but the room seemed to twist with every movement. The walls were shifting, warping, as if the house itself was alive, breathing, pulsing with an ancient energy. The air was thick, heavy with the weight of something forgotten, something that had been waiting for centuries. "I don't want any part of this," I said, my voice shaking, but even as I said it, I knew it wasn't entirely true. There was a part of me that had always felt this pull, this strange connection to something I couldn't explain. The legacy. The pact. "You already do," she said quietly, her voice soft, but with an edge of finality. "It's been waiting for you, and now you've come. Now you must make your choice." The whispers from the walls had grown louder, more frantic, as if they were speaking to me, calling me. I could hear them now, distinct voices, too many to count, all speaking at once. I couldn't understand them, but the tone was unmistakable, urgent, pleading. They were begging me to listen, to understand. The shadows in the corners of the room began to stretch out further, swirling like smoke, forming shapes that seemed almost human. I felt my breath catch in my throat, my pulse racing. There were eyes in the darkness, watching me, watching my every move. I tried to step back, but my feet felt heavy, as if they were stuck to the floor. The air was thick with pressure, pushing down on me. I felt the weight of something heavy, something ancient, pressing down on my chest. I couldn't breathe. The whispers, the shadows, the hum, it was all too much. "You have to make your choice now," the woman's voice cut through the noise, sharp and commanding. "You can leave, but the legacy will never leave you. Or you can accept it and join us in what we started." I looked around, desperate for any sign of escape. The windows were still sealed tight, and the door had disappeared. There was no way out. No place to run. "What are you talking about?" I choked out. "What's happening? What do you want from me?" The woman stepped into view, her face now illuminated by an eerie, cold light. Her expression was calm, almost serene, but there was something in her eyes, something dark, something predatory. "We don't want anything from you, not really," she said, her lips curling into a smile. "We only need you to accept what you are. To take your place." A chill ran down my spine. "What do you mean, take my place?" The shadows in the room seemed to sway as if in response to my words. They twisted, growing, and for a moment, I saw shapes moving in the dark, flickers of faces, familiar faces, faces that seemed to belong to my family, my ancestors. Their eyes were hollow, their mouths silent, but they were there, watching me. "You're the one who will carry the legacy now," she said softly, almost reverently. "You are the one who will continue what has been passed down through generations. The pact is yours now. You cannot escape it." The realization hit me like a tidal wave, and for the first time, I felt the full weight of what was happening. The legacy wasn't just some old family story. It was a living, breathing thing, a force that had shaped everything, every choice, every life in my family for centuries. And now it was mine. My bloodline had always been tied to this house, to this pact. I had always known, somewhere deep inside, that I was connected to something darker, something far beyond my understanding. And now I was being asked to embrace it. The woman stepped closer, her presence suffocating. "You have to accept it. You have to let go of everything you thought you knew and accept what you were born into." I felt the ground beneath me tremble. The air grew colder, and the whispering voices surged around me, louder now, filling every inch of the room. The shadows were no longer just shadows. They had become figures, solid, tangible. Figures that moved and reached for me. I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. All I could do was watch as they approached, these ancient figures, my ancestors, the ones who had been waiting for me. "Choose," the woman whispered, her voice a haunting melody in the chaos. "You are part of this. You always have been. The legacy will not be denied." I closed my eyes, my mind racing. What choice did I have? What was the right thing to do? And in that moment, I knew. The choice wasn't mine to make. As the shadows closed in around me, I felt the cold fingers of my ancestors touch my skin, pulling me deeper into the legacy, into the pact that had been waiting for me. The room went dark. The whispers ceased. And I was no longer alone. The legacy had claimed me. I woke up in a new place, a new life, with new possibilities. But deep down, something felt off. Have you ever experienced that feeling? Like you're stepping into someone else's shoes, wearing clothes that are just a little too tight, no matter how hard you try to adjust. Something was strange about this apartment, this space I had so eagerly moved into. It wasn't the size or the decor, those things were fine, even beautiful. It wasn't the creaky old floorboards that groaned with every step, or the faint smell of something old that lingered in the corners. No, it was something that couldn't be explained, something I couldn't see. At first, I thought it was nothing more than my imagination, a result of the move and the stress of starting over. But as the days passed, it became harder to ignore. I started to feel watched. It wasn't just the feeling of being alone in an unfamiliar place. It was the sensation of something being there, something that didn't belong. It wasn't just in the air, it was in the very walls themselves, whispering beneath the surface. At first, I shrugged it off, chalking it up to the weirdness that comes with moving into a new home. But one night, as I was unpacking a box of old books, I noticed something on the wall. It was just a faint mark at first, nothing more than a shadow in the corner of my eye. But when the light hit it just right, the mark seemed to reveal itself, as if it was waiting for me to notice. It wasn't just a stain or a crack in the plaster. No, it was something else entirely. A symbol. Strange and unfamiliar, but somehow deeply unsettling. The symbol was carved into the wall, faint but unmistakable. It was like a glyph, a mark that didn't belong in this apartment, this time. It wasn't until I changed the angle of the light that the symbol truly came to life. The more I adjusted the lamp, the clearer the design became, a twisting, spiraling figure etched into the wall, barely visible unless the light struck it at just the right angle. At first, I told myself it was just a weird quirk of the apartment, something that had been left behind by the previous tenants. Maybe it had a simple explanation, maybe it was just some strange decorative thing they had done, and I was just overthinking it. But the more I looked at it, the more uneasy I became. It felt deliberate, like it had been hidden, waiting for someone to find it. The feeling of being watched grew stronger. I couldn't shake the feeling that the symbol on the wall was more than just a mark. It was a message, one that I wasn't meant to understand. But if it had been left there for me to find, then maybe it had a purpose. I ran my fingers along the edges of the symbol, half expecting the wall to crumble away, revealing some hidden secret. But nothing happened. The wall was solid, unyielding. Still, I couldn't ignore the sensation that something lay behind it, something important. Something that needed to be uncovered. I decided to investigate further. That night, I searched through the apartment, looking for any clues, any sign that could explain the mark. I checked the windows, the cabinets, every corner of the place. But nothing seemed unusual except for the symbol. It was always there, just out of the corner of my eye, always waiting for me to turn toward it. It wasn't until I moved the couch, just trying to get things in order, that I noticed it. A faint outline on the wall behind it. The symbol didn't just exist on the surface, it extended into the wall itself, as though it was part of the very structure of the apartment. The edges of the wall seemed to warp where the symbol was, like the plaster had been molded into a shape it wasn't supposed to have. I took a deep breath, my heart racing. The thought of what this meant, what it might lead to, was enough to freeze me in place. I knew there was something here, something hidden, something that could explain the strange feeling that had plagued me since I first set foot in the apartment. I could feel the walls closing in. It wasn't just the symbol that was pulling me in, it was everything. The apartment. The history that I had no knowledge of. And most importantly, the feeling that someone, or something, had been here before me, leaving behind traces of a life I couldn't understand. It was time to uncover the truth. I began to examine the wall more closely, feeling the texture beneath my fingers, pushing against the plaster. Something was wrong. The wall didn't feel like the others. It felt thinner. The more I pressed, the more I felt the give. There was something behind it. My fingers found a small indentation, a crack I hadn't noticed before. With a quiet click, a section of the wall shifted, revealing a hidden compartment. A safe. My pulse quickened as I pulled at the mechanism, and the door slowly creaked open. Inside, there was nothing more than a stack of old, yellow documents. Some of the papers were folded, others were sealed with faded wax. I didn't know what I was expecting to find, but as I flipped through the documents, a chill ran down my spine. They were old records, documents belonging to the apartment's previous occupants. But as I read, I felt my stomach drop. These weren't just any records. They were family histories, and they seemed to date back centuries. The symbol on the wall was part of a deeper legacy, one tied to this place, to my apartment, and perhaps to me. And that's when I understood. I wasn't just living in someone else's home. I was living in their past. And it was not a past that was willing to stay hidden forever. The symbol was a key that had unlocked something that had been buried for far too long. And now, it was mine to uncover. I sat on the floor, the papers spread out in front of me, my fingers trembling as I sifted through them. The safe had opened like a door to a forgotten world, and with it, the unsettling realization that I wasn't simply a visitor in this apartment, I was part of something much larger than I had ever imagined. The documents were old, decades, perhaps even centuries old. Some were written in a language I couldn't quite recognize, while others were in a scrawling hand that appeared to belong to someone long dead. There were names, dates, and a series of strange symbols that matched the one I had seen on the wall. But it wasn't just the symbols that caught my attention, it was the names. My name wasn't there, but the names of people I didn't know seemed to echo through the pages, as if they were trying to tell me something. The more I read, the more I felt a connection between these people and myself, a connection that I couldn't yet explain. It felt as though the past was calling to me, urging me to understand. I had always known there was something strange about this apartment, but I had no idea it went this deep. I couldn't shake the feeling that these people, these unknown figures from the past, had left their mark on this place for a reason. But what was the reason? Why had I been chosen to uncover their secrets? The walls around me seemed to close in as I continued to read. I could feel the weight of their presence, as if the very air in the room had thickened with their ghosts. It was all too much, too overwhelming. I had to stop. I had to take a breath and clear my head. I stood up, pacing the room, trying to calm my racing thoughts. But it wasn't just the symbols and the papers that were getting to me, it was the feeling that something else was happening. Something beyond the physical. The light in the room flickered suddenly, casting the walls into shadows. I froze, my heart pounding. I had never noticed how eerily silent this place could be before. The silence now felt suffocating, as though the apartment itself was holding its breath. Then, the walls seemed to whisper. I froze in place, straining to hear. Was I imagining things? Was my mind playing tricks on me? The whispering came again, faint at first, like a rustle in the air, but then clearer. It was a voice. No, voices. I could almost make out words, but they were distorted, tangled, slipping just beyond my comprehension. I couldn't tell if they were coming from the walls or from somewhere deeper, hidden within the very foundation of the apartment. I walked cautiously toward the center of the room, my eyes darting to the corners. The atmosphere had shifted, and now it felt as though I was no longer alone. The presence of the past seemed to surround me, pressing in on all sides. I turned back to the papers, my mind racing. What did they mean? What were these people trying to tell me? As I rifled through the documents, one piece of paper caught my eye. It was a single sheet, unlike the others. It was more recent, dated just a few years ago. It was a letter, but the handwriting was different, cleaner than the scrawls of the older papers. The letter was addressed to someone named Eliza, and the signature at the bottom was familiar. It was the name of the person who had lived here before me, the person who had owned the apartment long before I arrived. Her name was Catherine Blackwood. I stared at the name, my mind racing. Blackwood. The name from the wall. The symbol. It was all coming together, but I still couldn't make sense of it. Who was Catherine Blackwood, and what did she want with me? Why had she left all of this behind? I unfolded the letter, my hand shaking as I read the words. Eliza, if you are reading this, then you have found the symbol. Do not be afraid. The truth about our family must be known, and you must continue what we started. The key is in the walls. The past will come alive, but you must be prepared for what it reveals. The letter was signed simply, Catherine. I sat back on the floor, feeling the weight of the letter in my hands. The symbol on the wall, the safe behind it, and now this letter, all of it pointed to something far bigger than I had ever expected. The feeling of being watched was stronger now, as though the apartment itself was holding its breath, waiting for me to understand. But what did Catherine mean by the truth about our family? And what was she asking me to continue? What was I supposed to do with all of this? I couldn't shake the feeling that the answers were within my reach, just beyond my grasp. But as I sat there, staring at the papers and the fading symbol on the wall, I knew one thing for sure: I was in over my head. The more I uncovered, the more I realized I wasn't just a bystander in this story. I was part of it. And whatever was hidden in the walls of this apartment was about to change everything. The next morning, I couldn't bring myself to leave the apartment. The air felt thick with the weight of the secrets that surrounded me, and the unease that had gripped me the night before hadn't faded. In fact, it had only intensified, like the steady tick of a clock counting down to something inevitable. I had to know more. The letter from Catherine Blackwood had left me with more questions than answers, but one thing was clear: there was something real behind all of this. The symbol on the wall, the safe, the letter, it was all tied together in a way I couldn't yet understand. But I was determined to find out what it meant. I started with the apartment itself. There had to be something, some hidden clue that could give me a clearer picture of Catherine's intentions. I began inspecting every inch of the room, checking for any marks or signs I might have missed before. But the place looked ordinary enough, too ordinary, almost as if it were trying to hide its true nature. I kept coming back to the wall, the one with the faint symbol. The sunlight, filtering through the window, cast strange shadows, just like the night before. The symbol seemed to shimmer, flicker, as if it were coming to life in the changing light. It was as though the very wall itself was alive, watching me, waiting for me to uncover its secrets. I ran my fingers along the edges of the symbol, tracing its outline carefully. It felt cold to the touch, almost unnatural. There was something about the way the lines curved that made my skin crawl. I pulled my hand back, and for a moment, I thought I saw something else, a figure, just at the edge of my vision, standing in the doorway. But when I turned to look, there was nothing there. My heart raced. Was I imagining things? I tried to dismiss it, telling myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me, but the feeling of being watched, of being followed, was overwhelming. I could still feel the presence of someone, or something, nearby. The walls seemed to breathe with me, exhaling in quiet whispers that I could no longer ignore. There was no denying it anymore. I had stumbled upon something much darker than I had ever anticipated. In a moment of panic, I rushed back to the safe. My hands were slick with sweat as I fumbled through the documents. The more I searched, the more I realized that Catherine had been leading me to something specific, something in the walls. I felt like I was on the edge of discovering something monumental, but the fear was starting to take over. What was she trying to tell me? I carefully examined the contents of the safe again, this time focusing on the more modern papers. One document in particular caught my attention, a photograph of a group of people standing in front of the apartment building. Catherine was in the center, her face young, vibrant, but there was something off about her eyes. They looked too intense, as if she were trying to communicate something through them. She wasn't alone. Around her stood several other people, all dressed in black, their expressions stern, unreadable. One of the people was an older man, his face shadowed, but his eyes, like Catherine's, were fixed on the camera with an unnerving intensity. I flipped the photo over, expecting it to be labeled with names, dates, anything that could tell me more. But there was nothing. Just a series of cryptic symbols scrawled across the back in a hurried hand. I held the photo in my hands, the weight of it pressing down on me. I could feel the eyes of the people in the picture following me, as if they were still here, in the room with me. The light in the room flickered again, casting strange shadows along the floor. The whispering came back, louder now, and I knew it wasn't just my imagination. The voices were growing, taking on a clearer tone. I turned back to the wall, my gaze fixed on the symbol. This time, I didn't hesitate. I ran my fingers over the lines once more, and as I did, a low click sounded from within the wall, followed by a faint groan, as though the very foundation of the building was shifting. The wall, it was moving. A small panel slid open, revealing a hidden compartment. My breath caught in my throat. Inside the compartment was a small box, old and weathered, with intricate carvings along the surface. I reached for it, trembling, and as my fingers brushed against the cold wood, the whispers grew louder, more insistent. They were no longer just voices, they were words, clear and direct, filling my mind. You have found it, Eliza. Now you must choose. Open it, and the truth will be revealed. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the box. The fear that had been growing inside me now surged to the surface, and I realized just how far I had gone. I could still walk away. I could close the compartment, leave the apartment and forget about all of this. But deep down, I knew I couldn't. I had come too far. The pull of the unknown was too strong. I opened the box. Inside was a small, folded piece of paper, aged and fragile. I carefully unfolded it, my heart pounding in my chest as I read the words written on it. The key to everything is in the blood. You must understand this symbol, Eliza, or it will consume you. I felt the blood drain from my face. The key to everything? The symbol? The blood? And then, as I read those final words, I heard it again, the faint, distant sound of footsteps behind me. The footsteps stopped. There was nothing, just a deep, suffocating silence that enveloped the room. My heart was pounding in my chest as I stood frozen in place, my hands gripping the paper so tightly that my fingers began to ache. My eyes darted around the room, searching, but the apartment was as still as it had ever been. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone anymore, that someone or something was waiting for me to make the next move. The air felt heavier now, as if the weight of the secret I had uncovered was pressing down on me from all sides. The sound of my breathing was the only thing I could hear, sharp and ragged in the silence. I slowly folded the piece of paper back and tucked it into my pocket. The words echoed in my mind, the key to everything is in the blood. You must understand this symbol, Eliza, or it will consume you. What did it mean? How could I possibly understand a symbol I couldn't even begin to decipher? And then, as if summoned by my thoughts, the light in the room flickered again. This time, it wasn't just a flicker, it was a violent surge, like the apartment was coming to life, alive with something ancient and restless. The walls creaked, the floorboards groaned, and the shadows seemed to stretch and twist, reaching toward me. I stumbled back, my pulse racing. I needed to get out. I needed to escape before whatever force was lurking in the apartment found me. But as I turned to head toward the door, something caught my eye. It was a faint reflection in a mirror on the far wall, just a brief flash, a silhouette. But I saw it clearly, the figure of a woman standing just behind me. I spun around, but there was no one there. My breath hitched in my throat. What was happening? Was I losing my mind? The whispering came again, louder now, as if it were coming from the very walls themselves. I pressed my hands to my ears, trying to block out the noise, but it was impossible. The words were too clear. You should have left, Eliza. Now it's too late. A cold chill swept over me, and I realized with a growing sense of horror that the apartment itself had become a prison. The walls, the shadows, the very air, I was surrounded by something I couldn't understand, something that was watching me, waiting for me to make the wrong move. I rushed to the door, my hands shaking as I fumbled for the handle. But the door wouldn't budge. It was as if it were sealed shut, locked by some invisible force that I couldn't break. I pounded on it, shouting, pleading for someone to hear me. But no one answered. There was only the endless, suffocating silence. I was trapped. I turned back to the center of the room, feeling the weight of the apartment closing in on me. The symbol on the wall had changed. It was no longer just a faint, ghostly outline. It was glowing, faintly at first, then more intensely, as if it were alive. The lines of the symbols seemed to shift and writhe, pulling at something deep inside me, urging me to understand, to unlock the truth. The blood. The words echoed again. The key to everything is in the blood. I didn't know what it meant, but I felt a sudden, overwhelming urge to go to the wall. Without thinking, I moved toward it, my feet moving almost of their own accord. As I drew closer, the symbols seemed to respond, the light flickering with an eerie pulse that matched the rhythm of my heart. I pressed my hand against the wall, feeling the coldness of it beneath my fingers. A deep, resonating hum filled the room, vibrating through the very floor beneath my feet. The air grew thick, charged with something I couldn't name. Then, with a jolt, the wall shifted. The faint outline of a door appeared, hidden in plain sight, as if it had always been there, waiting for me to discover it. I hesitated, my breath catching in my throat. This was it, the moment I had been waiting for. The truth, whatever it was on the other side of that door. But as I reached for the handle, I heard something else, the unmistakable sound of footsteps once again, but this time they were closer, much closer. The door creaked open slightly, revealing only darkness beyond. And as the footsteps drew near, I felt the cold touch of something, or someone, brush against the back of my neck. I froze. A low, rasping voice whispered in my ear, so close I could feel the breath on my skin. "You should have listened, Eliza. You never should have come." I turned to face the voice, but there was no one there. The apartment was empty. The room was empty. But the presence was still there, suffocating me, pressing against my chest. I had no choice. I had to open the door. With trembling hands, I pushed the door open fully, stepping into the darkness beyond. And that's when I heard it, the click. The sound of a lock snapping shut behind me. I didn't dare turn around, but I could feel the weight of the air behind me, thick and unyielding. The door had closed, its sound echoing in the emptiness, sealing me in. The darkness in front of me was complete, like a void, but I knew I couldn't stay where I was. I had to move forward. I took a step, my footfall muffled on the soft carpet of the hidden room. The floor felt different here, less familiar, as though this part of the apartment was not meant to be walked upon. The hairs on the back of my neck prickled, and I instinctively reached into my pocket, my fingers brushing the paper with the cryptic warning. "The key to everything is in the blood." The words echoed in my mind, a constant whisper that seemed to grow louder with every step. What was this place? What had I uncovered? I moved cautiously, my hands brushing along the walls as I felt my way through the darkness. The air was colder here, more oppressive, and it seemed to thrum with a strange energy. My eyes had adjusted to the dim light, but I still couldn't make out much. The only thing I could see clearly was the strange glow of the symbol on the wall, now unmistakably pulsating as if it had a life of its own. I approached it slowly, each movement careful. As my fingers brushed the surface of the wall, I felt a strange warmth beneath my touch, followed by a sudden shift in the atmosphere. The symbol had changed once again. It was no longer just an outline. It was now a deep, crimson hue, as though it were bleeding, alive. My pulse quickened. Something wasn't right. I could feel it deep in my bones. I glanced around, the feeling of being watched overwhelming. The silence was suffocating, broken only by the sound of my breathing and the distant, echoing noise that seemed to come from the walls themselves. It was like a low hum, growing louder, vibrating through the very air I breathed. And then I heard it. A voice, soft at first, like a distant murmur, but slowly growing clearer, more distinct. It was a woman's voice, familiar but distant, like a memory I couldn't quite place. "You shouldn't have come." The words were chilling, and they sent a shiver down my spine. I spun around, searching the darkness behind me, but there was nothing. Only shadows, only the ever-present sense that something was there, just out of reach. I moved forward, pressing my hand against the glowing symbol. A sharp shock ran through my fingers, and I yanked my hand back, startled. The symbol seemed to respond, the walls vibrating again, this time with a more forceful tremor. The room shifted, the walls groaning under some unseen pressure. Then, it all became clear. The symbol wasn't just a decoration, it was a key. A key to something hidden, something locked away. Something connected to my family's past, something that had been buried for years. The answer was just beyond my reach. I stepped back, my heart racing as the reality of what I had uncovered began to sink in. This place, this apartment, it wasn't just an old building. It was a trap. A prison. A place where secrets were buried, where history was hidden behind false walls. But there was no turning back now. I knew I had to find the truth, no matter the cost. I had to understand what had been left for me, what my ancestors had concealed so carefully. As I took another step forward, the air shifted again, and the humming sound turned into a low, guttural growl. I froze. Something was in the room with me. I didn't have to look to know that I wasn't alone. The temperature dropped suddenly, a frigid chill that cut through the air, making the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my trembling hands. And then, a figure appeared in the corner of my vision, a fleeting shadow, a silhouette that moved with unnatural speed. My breath caught in my throat, and I spun around, expecting to find something, someone, standing there. But again, there was nothing. Just the oppressive darkness and the sense of being watched. I couldn't stay here. I had to get out. My fingers fumbled for the door, my hand shaking as I gripped the handle. I wrenched it open, the sound of the lock snapping as I pushed against the door. I gasped in relief as the light from the hallway poured in, casting long shadows into the room. I stepped back, my mind racing as I tried to make sense of what I had just experienced. But before I could even process it, the door slammed shut behind me, plunging the room back into darkness. The silence was deafening. I leaned against the door, trying to catch my breath, when a voice, clear, unmistakable, sounded from behind me. "You shouldn't have opened it." I turned quickly, but there was no one there. And then, the walls around me seemed to pulse with the sound of footsteps, growing louder, closer. I wasn't alone. Hope your dreams are filled with fear. Good night.